Hey guys, tonight we embark on a journey into a story that has echoed through the centuries, a tale that has become a cornerstone of dark legends, whispered in hushed tones and sensationalized in countless retellings. We're delving into the history surrounding Elizabeth Báthory, the so-called Blood Countess of Hungary. Imagine, if you will, the flickering torchlight on cold ancient stone walls, the vast shadowy estates of 16th century Hungary, the rustle of heavy silk brocade, and perhaps the distant mournful sound of hunting horns echoing through dense dark forests. You are born into this world, a member of the immensely powerful Báthory family. Now, the tales surrounding Elizabeth are famously, shall we say, intense. If you're expecting a bedtime story that's all sweetness and light, perhaps envisioning fluffy sheep peacefully leaping over moonlit fences, well, you probably won't survive this one with your peaceful dreams entirely intact. But fear not, we're going to navigate these murky historical waters gently, focusing on the documented history, the societal context, and the gradual construction of the legend, rather than dwelling on any unverified or overly lurid horror movie hype. Our aim, as always, is a calm, quiet journey into the past. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your quiet support truly helps this channel to continue its explorations of these often complex and sometimes misunderstood historical narratives. And do let us know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see our historical meanderings reach far and wide, connecting us across time zones and continents. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. And your family, the Báthorys, are not just minor players in this grand, dangerous game. They are one of its leading houses. For generations, the Báthory name has been synonymous with immense wealth, vast land holdings stretching across Hungary and Transylvania, and formidable political and military power. They are one of the oldest and most influential aristocratic clans, their lineage producing voivodes, governors of great provinces, princes of Transylvania, who ruled with kingly authority, powerful cardinals of the church, and renowned military commanders whose exploits were celebrated in song and story. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Báthory family was incredibly influential, with distinct branches like the Somlyo and the Exed. You, Elizabeth, are born into the Exed line, a lineage that includes such formidable figures as Stephen Báthory, who just a few years after your birth would rise to become King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, one of the most powerful rulers in Eastern Europe. Your family tree isn't just a list of noble ancestors. It's a veritable who's who of Eastern European power brokers, with a few intriguing "who's that distant cousin who got exiled for treason" characters thrown in for good measure. Keeping track is practically a full-time diplomatic exercise. You draw your first breath sometime around the year 1560, or perhaps 1561, into a world that is both opulent and extraordinarily harsh. You are born into the very heart of the Kingdom of Hungary, a land caught in a maelstrom of political turmoil, a fractured frontier between great empires. For centuries, your homeland has been a bulwark against the relentless westward expansion of the mighty Ottoman Empire. The air you breathe is thick with the tension of constant warfare, of border skirmishes, of devastating raids and heroic, costly defenses. The kingdom itself is a patchwork, with parts under direct Ottoman rule, a central portion controlled by the Habsburg emperors of Austria, who also wear the Hungarian crown, and the semi-independent Principality of Transylvania, a frequent power base for ambitious Hungarian nobles, including many from your own illustrious kin. It is a violent, uncertain, and deeply hierarchical time. Your earliest memories are likely formed within the cold, imposing stone walls of a family castle, perhaps the ancient seat of Exit, or the somewhat more modern Near Badr. You are surrounded by an almost unimaginable degree of privilege. Servants attend to your every need. Your gowns are of fine imported fabrics, and your world is one of expansive estates and the deference due to your noble blood. But this privilege is cocooned within a reality of constant intrigue and often brutal power struggles, even within noble families themselves. The tapestries that adorn the castle walls might depict heroic battle scenes or serene pastoral landscapes, but the underlying reality of your world is one where power is often maintained through force of arms and ruthless determination. You would have been aware, even as a child, of the martial culture of the Hungarian nobility, the constant presence of armed retainers, the discussions of military campaigns and Ottoman threats that would have filled the great hall. The family motto probably wasn't something along the lines of live, laugh. More likely, it was closer to rule, conquer, and try not to get assassinated by your ambitious second cousin twice removed. Catchy, in its own rather pragmatic way. The tumultuous nature of the era cannot be overstated. Beyond the ever-present shadow of the Ottoman Wars, with their cycles of devastation and uneasy truces, internal conflicts frequently erupted among the Hungarian magnates themselves, vying for influence, land, and royal favor. Religious strife also cast a long shadow. The Protestant Reformation had swept through Hungary, gaining many adherents among the nobility, including some branches of your own Báthory family, who embraced Calvinism. This set them against the staunchly Catholic Habsburg rulers and led to further tensions and divisions within the kingdom. It was an age of profound faith, but also of intense religious conflict and persecution. Historians still argue whether the documented instances of extreme cruelty and unusual, sometimes shocking, behavior that occasionally surfaced within some branches of the European nobility during this period were truly exceptional, isolated aberrations, or if they, to some extent, reflected a more widespread societal desensitization to violence in an era marked by almost constant warfare, brutal public executions for even minor crimes, and stark, almost unimaginable social inequalities between the immensely powerful aristocracy and the vast majority of the serf population. You might, as a Báthory infant of high status, have had your swaddling clothes made of the finest imported linen, perhaps edged with delicate silver thread, and your first lullabies might well have been ancient Hungarian heroic epics, recounting tales of valor and vengeance, sung to the distant, rhythmic sound of sharpening swords and the neighing of war horses in the castle courtyard, a perfectly normal, even reassuring, nursery environment for a future aristocrat destined to navigate these volatile and often unforgiving lands. Born into this crucible of immense wealth, almost unbridled power, and perennial, existential conflict, your early years, as a Báthory noblewoman, would have been anything but ordinary, and certainly not sheltered from the harsher realities of your time. The lessons you learned, both those formally taught to you within the castle walls, and those absorbed simply by observing the world around you, would inevitably shape the woman you were destined to become. A woman whose name would one day become inextricably linked with some of the darkest legends in European history. Says, born into that crucible of immense wealth, almost unparalleled power, and the perennial, often brutal, conflict that characterized 16th century Hungary. Your early years as a young Báthory noblewoman would have been a very specific and highly structured kind of ordinary. The lessons you absorbed, both those formally imparted by tutors within the imposing castle walls, and those learned through the subtle osmosis of observing the complex world around you, were all meticulously designed to shape you into the woman your lineage, your fortune, and your society expected you to become. To this end, your formal education, likely delivered by private tutors within the family castle, would have been surprisingly comprehensive for the era, though with a distinct gendered focus. Literacy was certainly expected. You would have learned to read and write in your native Hungarian, of course, but proficiency in Latin was also highly probable, as it was the international language of scholarship, diplomacy, and the church. Even if your family, like many Hungarian nobles, had embraced Protestantism, understanding Latin would allow you to read devotional texts, perhaps some carefully selected classical authors, though extensive classical studies were more common for boys, and to comprehend legal documents or important family correspondence. German, too, might have featured in your curriculum, given the close political ties with the Habsburg court and the prevalence of German speakers in some Hungarian towns and among certain segments of the nobility. Your screen time, you might sardonically reflect, would have consisted of staring intently at a meticulously illuminated manuscript for hours while perfecting your elegant script, or perhaps gazing thoughtfully out of a narrow arrow-slit castle window at the unchanging and probably quite muddy castle courtyard below. Thrilling stuff by 16th century aristocratic standards. The primary purpose of your education as a girl of your exalted rank was not to prepare you for a profession in the way we might understand it today. Rather, it was to groom you for an advantageous marriage, a strategic alliance with another powerful noble family that would further consolidate wealth, extend influence, and ensure the continuation of your dynasty. You were expected to become a capable mistress of vast estates, a gracious hostess, a bearer of legitimate heirs, and an unwavering upholder of your family's considerable honor and prestige. Think of your childhood less as a carefree period of play and discovery, and more as an extended, very exclusive, and incredibly high-stakes finishing school. Arithmetic would have been another essential skill. As the future mistress of a large household and potentially vast agricultural estates, you would need to understand basic accounting, to oversee household budgets, to manage supplies, and to ensure that the stewards and bailiffs who ran your lands were not, shall we say, overly creative with their bookkeeping. Religious instruction would also have been paramount. You would have learned your catechism, your prayers, and the specific tenets of your family's faith, likely Calvinist Protestantism, for the exit branch of the Báthorys, a faith that emphasized scripture, discipline, and a somewhat austere piety, at least in theory. It is a mainstream historical fact that literacy rates among the Hungarian nobility, including women of high rank, were relatively high for this period, certainly compared to the general serf population. Noble women were often quite capable of managing extensive household correspondence, keeping detailed accounts, and engaging with learned religious texts. Alongside this more academic instruction, there would have been rigorous training in the social and domestic arts. You would learn the intricate dance of noble etiquette, how to greet visitors of varying rank, how to preside over a banquet, how to engage in polite politic conversation, how to manage a large retinue of servants with a firm but fair hand. Needlework and embroidery were not just genteel pastimes, but highly valued skills, and you would have spent countless hours perfecting your stitches, producing fine linens, tapestries, and embellished clothing for your trousseau, for the adornment of your future home, or as prestigious gifts. You might also have been taught some basic knowledge of herbal remedies and the rudiments of household medicine, as the lady of the castle was often the first resort for the ailments of her family and servants. Your world was one of undeniable opulence, gowns of rich velvet and imported silk, perhaps jewels inherited through generations, meals served on silver platters, though forks were still a bit of a novelty, and you'd mostly be using your fingers and a personal knife. Yet, it was also a world of considerable rigidity. Castles, for all their grandeur, could be cold, drafty, and surprisingly lacking in what we would consider basic comforts. Personal freedom, especially for a young, unmarried noblewoman, was severely limited. Your life path was largely predetermined by the strategic interests of your family. Marriage was not typically a matter of romantic love or personal choice, but a carefully negotiated dynastic alliance designed to consolidate property and power. Your toys, if you had many, might have included intricately carved wooden figures, perhaps a solemn-faced doll dressed in miniature court finery, mirroring your own restrictive garments, or you might have listened with carefully concealed, wide-eyed fascination as a nursemaid or a visiting minstrel recounted stirring, if occasionally rather terrifying, Hungarian folk tales filled with valiant Magyar knights, cunning, fire-breathing dragons, and the occasional grumpy, unpredictable forest spirit who really disliked overly inquisitive noble children. All perfectly normal bedtime story material, of course, for a young aristocrat of your standing. Growing up within a family so deeply enmeshed in the high-stakes game of Hungarian politics and the ongoing wars against the Ottomans, you would have been acutely aware of the realities of power, even if shielded from its most brutal, day-to-day manifestations. You would have overheard hushed, urgent conversations between your father and his advisors, witnessed the comings and goings of important military commanders and political envoys, perhaps even sensed the underlying tension of family feuds or the precariousness of alliances. Learning Latin, you might have wryly noted, was probably less about appreciating the subtleties of Ovid and more about being able to understand precisely why your uncle Istvan had been excommunicated by the Pope again, or why a particular treaty with the Habsburgs was causing so much familial consternation. Keeping up with the family drama practically required a classical education. And so, through these formative years of structured lessons, demanding social refinements, and constant, if often indirect, immersion in the complex, perilous world of high nobility, you were meticulously shaped and prepared. Every skill you learned, from deciphering a Latin phrase to managing a household budget, from executing a graceful curtsy to understanding the subtle hierarchies of power, was designed to equip you for the next inevitable and all-important chapter in the life of a wealthy and well-connected Báthory heiress. A strategically advantageous and dynastically powerful marriage, and with it, the vast and challenging responsibilities of becoming the undisputed mistress of your own great estates and castles. Historians who study the upbringing of noble women in early modern Europe continue to debate the extent to which their often quite rigorous education and strict social conditioning truly prepared them for positions of actual power and independent agency, versus primarily grooming them for essentially supportive, albeit influential, roles within overwhelmingly male-dominated dynastic and political structures. Your social media, your source of news and connection to the wider world, would have been the carefully filtered, often politically charged, gossip brought by visiting ladies-in-waiting or traveling kinsmen, delivered with all the speed and verifiable reliability of a three-legged tortoise, meticulously carrying a very heavy and possibly coded scroll. And so, through those formative years of rigorous lessons, careful social refinements, and a constant, if often indirect, immersion in the complex and perilous world of High Hungarian nobility. You were meticulously shaped and prepared, every Latin phrase dutifully memorized, every intricate embroidery stitch perfected, every lesson in household management absorbed, was designed to equip you for the next inevitable and all-important chapter in the life of a wealthy and exceptionally well-connected Báthory heiress, a strategically advantageous and dynastically powerful marriage. And with that union would come the vast and often daunting responsibilities of becoming the undisputed mistress of your own great estates and formidable castles. True to the customs of your era and your exalted social stratum, your marriage was not born of some flighty romantic attachment, but was a carefully calculated alliance. Around the tender age of 15, in the year 1575, you, Elizabeth Báthory, were wed to Ferenc Nádasdy, a scion of another of Hungary's most powerful and influential Protestant noble families. This was a union of considerable strategic importance, further cementing the power and influence of both the Báthory and Nádasdy clans in a kingdom perpetually fraught with internal divisions and external threats. Your husband, Ferenc, was already a renowned soldier, a fierce warrior celebrated for his valor in the unending wars against the Ottoman Turks, a man who would earn the formidable moniker the Black Knight of Hungary, or the Black Bey, for his military prowess, and perhaps his dark, imposing appearance. His life was one of almost constant campaigning, meaning he would often be absent from his estates for long, arduous periods. The wedding itself was likely a grand, ostentatious affair, a lavish spectacle designed to display the combined wealth and power of two of the kingdom's leading families. Imagine days of feasting, tournaments, music, and intricate diplomatic courtesies, attended by hundreds of nobles from across Hungary and beyond. Then, as Ferenc's wife, you would have moved to his ancestral lands, taking up residence in one of his primary castles, perhaps the somewhat remote Countess Castle, Szécely, in Hungarian, nestled in the foothills of the Carpathians, in what is now Slovakia, or the more expansive Sarvar Castle, in western Hungary. With Ferenc so frequently away on the battlefield, engaged in the brutal realities of defending the Hungarian frontier, the immense responsibility of managing his vast estates and households fell squarely upon your young shoulders. This was not an unusual situation for the wives of prominent military nobles in 16th and 17th century Europe. Indeed, it was an expected part of their role, and your Báthory upbringing, with its emphasis on literacy, numeracy, and a certain steely pragmatism, would have prepared you well for these duties. You were not merely a decorative chatelaine. You were in effect the acting head of a vast agricultural and economic enterprise. Your daily to-do list might have included 1. Ensure there's enough firewood meticulously stacked to last through a long, harsh Hungarian winter. Adjudicate a rather heated dispute between two serf families regarding the precise ownership of a particularly productive and possibly quite aggressive pig. 3. Compose a sternly worded letter to the estate steward about a suspicious shortfall in the reported chicken egg count. 4. And of course, try not to let the sheer existential weight of managing the lives and livelihoods of several thousand recalcitrant serfs entirely crush your spirit before luncheon. All perfectly standard noblewoman stuff, you see. Your days would have been filled with a relentless routine of supervision, instruction, correspondence, and meticulous account-keeping. You would oversee the agricultural activities on your lands, the planting and harvesting of crops like wheat and rye, the management of livestock, the productivity of mills and fishing ponds, the sustainable use of forests. You were responsible for ensuring the collection of rents and feudal dues from the serfs and tenant farmers who worked your lands, a task requiring both firmness and a degree of careful diplomacy. You would keep detailed household accounts, tracking expenditures on everything from wine and candles to repairs for the castle roof and wages for your numerous servants. You deal directly with your stewards, bailiffs, and other estate officials, receiving their reports, issuing your instructions, and ensuring your husband's and by extension, your family's interests were well protected. It's a mainstream historical fact that noble women in early modern Hungary, particularly those whose husbands were often absent due to military campaigns or political duties at court, frequently managed these extensive estates with considerable skill and held significant de facto authority within their domains. Their literacy and numeracy skills were not just accomplishments, they were vital tools for survival and prosperity. Beyond the purely economic aspects, you also had significant social and even legal responsibilities within your own household and among the serfs on your immediate estates. You might be called upon to dispense justice for minor offenses, to settle disputes, or to enforce local customs. Providing some measure of charity or aid to the local communities, particularly in times of famine or hardship, was also a traditional, if sometimes inconsistently applied, role of the nobility. You would be expected to host visiting dignitaries, to maintain social connections with other noble families through correspondence and occasional visits, and to always represent your husband's status and honor with grace and authority, even in his prolonged absence. And of course there was the crucial dynastic duty of bearing and raising children. You would eventually have several, including Pal, who would continue the Nadasdi line, their upbringing and early education also falling under your purview. The Wi-Fi in Joktas Castle, you might jest to yourself, was notoriously unreliable, mostly because it involved dispatching a rider on a horse for 3 days, if you actually wanted to messages someone. Slightly less convenient than hitting send, one must admit. Life within those castle walls, while certainly one of privilege, was also one of considerable responsibility, and at times profound isolation, especially if the castle was situated in a remote, rugged region. Your days were less about leisurely pursuits and more about the constant, demanding work of governance. Historians who examine the daily lives and extensive correspondence of early modern noblewomen continue to debate the precise balance between their considerable agency and autonomy in managing these vast estates and complex households, and the overarching patriarchal societal structures that ultimately defined and often limited their legal and social power, particularly in relation to their husbands and their powerful male kin. Part of your many duties, you might recall, could include the annual painstaking inspection of the castle's entire supply of beeswax for candle production each autumn, a surprisingly important and time-consuming task, as good, reliable light was a true luxury, not to be squandered. Or perhaps you found yourself personally overseeing the yearly brewing of beer or the fermentation of mead for the entire household, ensuring that the traditional recipe, passed down with solemn gravity by your Nadasti mother-in-law, was followed precisely to the letter, lest you incur her spectral disapproval from beyond the grave, or even worse, serve embarrassingly weak ale to important, and possibly quite judgmental, visiting dignitaries. And so you settle into your demanding role as the formidable mistress of these vast Nadasti estates, your days meticulously filled with the myriad responsibilities of local governance, the careful scrutiny of account books, and the endless, often repetitive, demands of running a great and complex household. Life within the ancient, cold stone walls of your castle is a complex tapestry woven from threads of order, unwavering duty, and the exercise of immense, almost unquestioned, local authority. But even the thickest, most imposing stone walls, you might come to realize, cannot always contain every secret, every discontent, every whispered rumor, and eventually, faint, deeply unsettling whispers might just begin to drift, like an unseen chilling draft, through the cold, echoing corridors of your domain. And so, you settle into your demanding role as the formidable mistress of the vast Nodesty estates. Your days a meticulously choreographed ballet of governance, account books, maternal duties, and the endless, often thankless, responsibilities of managing a great and complex household. Life within the ancient, cold stone walls of your primary castle, be it the imposing fortress of Choctaw or the sprawling domains of Sarvar, is a complex tapestry woven from threads of unwavering order, unquestioned duty, and the constant exercise of immense, almost absolute, local authority. You are a powerful woman in a world largely dominated by men, wielding considerable influence within your sphere. But even the thickest, most imposing stone walls, you might eventually come to realize, cannot always contain every discontent, every fearful glance, every hushed, resentful secret. And eventually, like an unseen chilling draft seeping through unseen cracks, faint, deeply unsettling whispers might just begin to drift through the cold, echoing corridors of your domain, and then beyond them. The very nature of rumor in these early years of the 17th century is a potent, unpredictable force. In an era without widespread literacy for the common folk, without printed newspapers delivering daily tidings, information, and more often, misinformation, spreads primarily through word of mouth. Gossip exchanged between servants in the castle kitchens or stables, tales carried by traveling peddlers or itinerant monks from one village to the next, hushed conversations around meager peasant hearthfires. This is how news and rumor travels. And in a society that is deeply hierarchical, often steeped in lingering medieval superstitions, and where the lives of the nobility can seem impossibly distant and mysterious to those who serve them, such whispers can take on a life of their own, growing and distorting with each retelling. Rumors about the eccentricities or cruelties of the powerful were not uncommon, sometimes fueled by simple envy, sometimes by genuine fear, and occasionally, perhaps, by carefully planted political motives. The seeds for such negative talk, even if initially without monstrous proportions, could be sown in many ways within your domain. As the chatelaine responsible for hundreds, if not thousands, of servants, serfs, and tenant farmers, you wielded considerable authority, and with that came the necessity of discipline. In an age where insubordination, theft, or simple incompetence could have serious consequences for the smooth running of a vast agricultural enterprise, a firm hand was expected. Stern measures, perhaps even physical punishment for transgressions, were commonplace and largely accepted as the prerogative of the nobility. However, if your methods of discipline were perceived by those beneath you as excessively harsh, unusually frequent, or unpredictably erratic, even by the often brutal standards of the time, it could certainly breed deep resentment, fear, and the kind of hushed, bitter stories that servants might share only amongst themselves in the dead of night. The very isolation and inherent aloofness of castle life could also contribute. While your husband, Ferent Nodesty, was away fighting the Ottomans, you were often the sole supreme authority on your estates for extended periods. A powerful noblewoman, governing vast lands, might easily be seen by the local populace as a remote, perhaps even intimidating, or mysterious figure. This distance, this lack of everyday familiarity, could make you a blank canvas onto which villagers might project their own fears or create their own speculative narratives. Social friction, too, could play a part. Disputes with lesser nobles over land or resources, disagreements with local merchants over prices, or perhaps even conflicts with local clergy over tithes or religious observances, could all generate negative talk that might slowly but surely attach itself to your name. The content of these earliest whispers, as they begin to circulate, is likely vague, amorphous, and largely unsubstantiated by any verifiable proof. You might hear, indirectly of course, through a loyal chambermaid or a concerned steward, faint murmurs about serving girls being treated with undue severity. Tales of young women who went to work at one of your castles and either did not return to their villages or came back changed, perhaps sullen, fearful, or bearing the marks of harsh discipline. There might be talk of unexplained illnesses, or of a certain coldness, a perceived lack of compassion emanating from the castle. In an era where life was precarious and death, especially among the poor and powerless, was a frequent visitor from many causes, it would be easy for such occurrences, even if unrelated or misunderstood, to be woven into a darker, more sinister pattern by the fearful or the malicious. There is no talk yet, you must understand, of the lurid, blood-soaked atrocities that later legend would ascribe to you. These are for now just indistinct shadows, unsettling rumors of harshness and strange goings-on. These whispers would likely originate with and be spread by those closest to the daily workings of your household, disgruntled or genuinely frightened servants, both those currently in your employ and those who may have left your service under a cloud. From them, the stories might filter down to the local villagers who interact with the castle, perhaps supplying it with goods or sending their daughters into service. It's a mainstream historical fact that the relationship between feudal lords and ladies and their serfs and servants in early modern Europe was one of profound, almost absolute, power imbalance. While a sense of paternalistic duty and care certainly existed in many noble households, so too did the undeniable potential for exploitation, neglect, and harsh, arbitrary treatment. Such conditions could undoubtedly lead to deep-seated discontent and the clandestine spread of negative rumors that might be entirely true, wildly exaggerated, or even completely false, but which found fertile ground in fear and powerlessness. You, Elizabeth, in your imposing stone fortress, might initially be entirely unaware of these faint, subterranean currents of gossip. Or, if they reached your ears, you might dismiss them with the haughty disdain of a Báthory, as the meaningless grumblings of ignorant peasants, or the spiteful fabrications of lazy or incompetent servants whom you had rightly disciplined. What concern was it of yours what the lower orders muttered amongst themselves, as long as the work of the estate was done and your authority remained outwardly unchallenged? Controlling the flow of gossip within a vast household and its surrounding villages would be an almost impossible task anyway. Your official response to any early vague rumors of unpleasantness or unusual strictness in the servants' quarters, if you deigned to offer one at all, might simply be a curt nonsense. The new straw pallets in the scullery are perfectly adequate, mostly, for straw that is. Historians examining the voluminous and often contradictory records of the later Báthory case still grapple with the precise timeline and the initial, specific nature of these accusations. They continue to debate exactly when and how these vague local rumors about the harsh mistreatment of serving girls might have begun to coalesce into more concrete, more specific, and ultimately more alarming complaints that eventually, somehow, managed to transcend the vast social distance, and reach the ears of higher, more powerful authorities. In the villages surrounding your imposing castle, perched high on its lonely hill, there might be age-old, half-forgotten tales of unlucky manners, or of stern-hearted countesses from generations long past. Such local folklore, simmering constantly beneath the surface of daily life, could make unexpectedly fertile ground for any new, unsettling rumor that drifts down from the castle, whether that rumor has any real substance or is merely a product of fear and imaginative speculation. You might even suspect, with a touch of aristocratic paranoia, that the castle's very acoustics are somehow specifically designed by mischievous local spirits to carry the most salacious and unflattering gossip directly to the ears of your least favorite and most judgmental, distant cousin, who then, you imagine, embellishes it with dramatic flair and perhaps even an interpretive dance for the entertainment of the local pastor. For a time then, these whispers might remain just that, faint, unsubstantiated, and largely ignored murmurs, confined to the lower echelons of your household or the nearby insignificant villages. They are easily dismissed, perhaps, as the predictable grumblings of disgruntled former servants, the superstitious fears of ignorant peasants, or the envious mutterings of those who resent your family's immense power and wealth. But whispers, if they are persistent enough, if they speak of things that touch upon deep societal fears or transgress perceived boundaries of even aristocratic behavior, have a peculiar way of gathering strength, of coalescing, of traveling much further than initially expected. Eventually, they might just reach ears that are far more powerful, far more influential, and far less inclined to simply ignore them as inconsequential peasant gossip. For a time, those faint, unsettling whispers that began to drift through the cold, echoing corridors of your domain might have remained just that, indistinct murmurs, easily dismissed as the idle chatter of disgruntled servants or the superstitious fears of the local peasantry. You, Elizabeth Báthory, a countess of immense wealth and formidable lineage, likely paid them little heed at first, if indeed they even reached your exalted ears in any coherent form. Such is the prerogative of power. But whispers, especially those freighted with a cargo of fear and persistent accusation, have a tenacious quality. If they are repeated often enough, if they speak of matters that transgress even the broadly accepted, often harsh norms of your era, they can begin to coalesce, to gather a disturbing momentum. They can travel like thistledown on the wind, further than expected, eventually reaching ears that are far more powerful, far more influential, and far less inclined to simply dismiss them as inconsequential village gossip. And so it was that these troubling rumors, likely circulating for some years, perhaps starting around 1602 or intensifying after the death of your husband Ferenc Nadasdy in 1604, began their slow, arduous journey up the complex ladder of Hungarian society. Perhaps a local Lutheran pastor, like Istvan Magyari, who is sometimes cited in historical accounts as having voiced concerns, relayed these alarming tales to his superiors in the church. Or maybe disgruntled lesser nobles, with their own grievances or ambitions, saw an opportunity and passed along what they had heard to more powerful patrons. Eventually, through these various channels, the increasingly disturbing reports concerning your conduct and the alleged happenings within your castles, particularly Shaktis, reached the very highest echelons of power in the Kingdom of Hungary. They reached the king himself, Matthias II, who was also Holy Roman Emperor, and more directly, his most powerful representative in Hungary, the Palatine. The man occupying this august position at the crucial time, from 1609 onwards, was Count Georgi Thorzo. The Palatine of Hungary was the highest-ranking official in the kingdom, after the monarch, effectively the king's viceroy, wielding immense judicial, administrative, and even military authority. Thorzo was a significant figure in his own right, a wealthy and influential nobleman, a renowned military commander in the wars against the Ottomans, and a prominent Lutheran, which was religiously significant in a kingdom still navigating the complex currents of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. His motivations for eventually taking action against a member of the extraordinarily powerful Báthory family were likely complex and manifold: a genuine sense of duty to uphold justice and investigate such serious allegations, a desire to maintain order, and the reputation of the Hungarian nobility as a whole, perhaps even political considerations related to the immense wealth and influence of the Báthory Nádasdy estates, or pressure from the Habsburg court in Vienna to curb the sometimes fiercely independent Hungarian magnates. It's a mainstream historical fact that Georgi Thorzo initiated a formal investigation into the allegations against you, Elizabeth Báthory, around the year 1610, and this investigation would become one of the most sensational and notorious cases of his tenure. Thorzo did not act rashly, investigating, let alone accusing, a member of your family, Elizabeth, a family that included Transylvanian princes and a Polish king, was an undertaking fraught with potential political dynamite. It could stir up immense opposition, create dangerous feuds between powerful noble houses, and bring unwelcome scandal upon the entire Hungarian aristocracy. So, when he finally decided to proceed, it was likely because the sheer volume and perceived credibility of the complaints had become impossible to ignore, or perhaps because influential figures had formally petitioned him to act. The formal investigation, once launched, would have been a meticulous, if slow, process by the standards of the day. Thorzo didn't exactly have a fleet of high-speed carriages or a dedicated team of forensic scientists with DNA kits at his disposal. His investigators, likely trusted notaries, perhaps accompanied by a small contingent of soldiers for authority and protection, would have embarked on long, arduous journeys on horseback, traveling to the regions around your various castles, particularly Chaptis, Sarvar, and Deutschkreuz, Nemekerestor. Their primary task was to gather evidence, most notably by taking sworn testimonies from anyone who claimed to have knowledge of the alleged misdeeds. This meant seeking out and interviewing a wide range of potential witnesses, current and former servants from your households, maids, cooks, stable hands, estate workers, as well as local villagers, clergy, and possibly even members of the lesser nobility who lived in the vicinity of your estates. The investigators would have to be persistent and persuasive, as many potential witnesses would have been terrified to speak out against a figure as powerful and perhaps as feared as yourself. The difficulty of verifying claims in an era without modern investigative techniques, relying almost entirely on eyewitness accounts and hearsay, often given years after the alleged events, cannot be overstated. The evidence they sought would not just be vague rumors. They would be looking for specific details, names of alleged victims, dates, locations, and any corroborating accounts from multiple independent sources. They might also inquire about any unusual occurrences, any disturbing signs, or perhaps even search for physical evidence if opportunity and local cooperation allowed, though this aspect is often shrouded in the more sensational and less verifiable parts of the Báthory legend. The primary focus, according to the surviving documents, seems to have been on the alleged mistreatment and unexplained deaths or disappearances of numerous young women, mainly servant girls and daughters of local peasants who had entered your service. This investigation was unfolding against a backdrop of significant political and social tension. The immense wealth of the combined Báthory and Noblewoman estates was certainly a factor that some historians suggest might have played a role in the vigor of the prosecution. Powerful families always had rivals who might benefit from their downfall. There was also likely a desire on the part of the king and Palatine Thurzo to avoid a massive public scandal that could tarnish the image of the Hungarian nobility in the eyes of both their own people and foreign powers, especially given the ongoing struggles with the Ottoman Empire and the delicate relationship with the Habsburgs. You imagine Thurzo's investigators had a special, very sharp quill reserved for really quite alarming allegations of an unspeakable natures, and perhaps another, slightly blunter one, for probably just grumpy servant gossip and complaints about the quality of the gruel. The true agonizing challenge for them, and for historians ever since, has been figuring out which testimony belonged in which category. During this period, you, Elizabeth, are still a formidable noblewoman, presumably residing in one of your castles, most famously Countess. You would almost certainly have become aware that an official inquiry, sanctioned by the Palatine himself, was underway. Your reaction can only be speculated upon. Perhaps defiant indignation at such an affront to your noble status, or frantic attempts to use your considerable family influence and connections to halt the proceedings. Perhaps a growing sense of unease, or even fear, or maybe, initially, a continued belief that your rank, your name, and your wealth would ultimately shield you from any serious consequences. When the Palatine's men, with their official bearing and their pointed, uncomfortable questions about your somewhat unorthodox staff retention policies, begin to appear in the villages surrounding your castle, you know it's probably not because they're planning to award you a commendation for excellence in feudal estate management. Historians continue to debate Gothic Thurzo's primary motivations in pursuing the Báthory investigation with such undeniable vigor. Were his actions driven by a genuine horrified pursuit of justice in the face of overwhelming evidence of terrible crimes? Or were there also elements of political opportunism? Perhaps a desire to confiscate the vast Báthory estates for the crown or for other noble families? Or was he acting under pressure from the Habsburg court in Vienna, which was always keen to curb the independent power of the great Hungarian magnates? The truth is likely a complex tapestry woven from all these threads. And so, under the powerful and determined direction of the Palatine Georgi Thurzo, the formal investigation into the deeply unsettling affairs surrounding your estates grinds slowly, methodically, but inexorably forward. His men travel from village to village, from castle to castle. They question, they listen, they meticulously record names, dates, and alleged deeds. And at the very heart of their inquiry, forming the grim foundation upon which any future action will inevitably be built, are the voices of those who claim to have witnessed the unthinkable, the harrowing testimonies of servants, villagers, and perhaps others, whose words once committed to parchment now carry the terrifying potential to shatter your world, to dismantle your power, and to forever blacken your formidable family name. And so, under the powerful and determined direction of the Palatine Georgi Thurzo, the formal investigation into the deeply unsettling affairs surrounding your estates, particularly the looming fortress of Countess, grinds slowly, methodically, but inexorably forward. His men, the notaries and officials dispatched with the king's authority, travel from village to village, from one Noblewoman estate to another. They question, they listen, with grim patience, They meticulously record names, dates, and the chilling details of alleged deeds. And at the very heart of their inquiry, forming the grim and undeniable foundation upon which any future action will inevitably be built, are the voices of those who claim to have witnessed the unthinkable, the harrowing testimonies of servants, villagers, and perhaps a few others, whose words, once committed to official parchment, now carry the terrifying potential to shatter your world, to dismantle your considerable power, and to forever blacken your formidable family name. Who were these individuals, these voices of accusation that now threaten to engulf you? Elizabeth Báthory, Countess Báthory. They were, primarily, people from the lower rungs of the rigid social ladder of your time. Many were young women, or the parents of young women, who had served in your various castles, Chactas, Sarvar, Deutschkreuz, and Vienna. They were chambermaids, scullery maids, laundry girls, seamstresses, drawn from the local peasant population, or perhaps the daughters of impoverished lesser gentry, seeking service in a great noble household, as was customary. There were also testimonies from men who had worked on your estates, from local villagers who had lived in the shadow of your castles, and significantly, from some individuals who had held positions of slightly greater trust or responsibility within your household staff, people who might have been privy to more than the average stable boy or kitchen helper. The power imbalance between these witnesses, largely illiterate, impoverished, and accustomed to absolute deference to the nobility, and you, their high-born, immensely wealthy, and legally privileged mistress, was almost unimaginably vast. To speak out against you, even to the Palatine's men, would have required extraordinary courage, or perhaps an equally extraordinary level of desperation and fear. The process of taking their testimony would have been formal and likely quite intimidating for many of them. Those SOS investigators, men like Andras Karasturi and Moses Chiraki, whose names appear in the historical records, would summon these potential witnesses. Picture a dimly lit room, perhaps in a local parsonage or a village inn commandeered for the purpose. The notary sits at a rough wooden table, his inkpot and quills at the ready, a stack of parchment before him. The witness, often a young, frightened peasant girl, or a grieving, angry parent, stands or sits before these stern-faced officials, men representing the distant, almost mythical power of the king and the Palatine. Questions are asked, likely through interpreters, if various local dialects of Hungarian, Slovak, or German were involved. Their words, halting and perhaps hesitant at first, are painstakingly translated and transcribed, sworn to with an oath upon a Bible or some other sacred object, an act of profound significance and considerable spiritual weight in that deeply religious era. One can only imagine the conditions under which these statements were given, the palpable fear of retribution if you, the Countess, were to somehow escape censure, the subtle or perhaps not so subtle pressure from the investigators themselves, who were, after all, building a case, but also, for some, undoubtedly a desperate hope for justice, for an end to perceived suffering, or simply for an answer to what had become of their missing daughters. The nature of the accusations, as they were recorded, painted a grim picture. We must tread carefully here, for our purpose is calm historical reflection, not the retailing of sensational horrors. The testimonies, by and large, spoke of severe and frequent physical mistreatment of servant girls, often for the most minor of infractions, a poorly stitched seam, a moment of perceived idleness, a dropped plate. They described punishments that were alleged to be excessively cruel, far exceeding what might have been considered normal or acceptable, even within the harsh disciplinary standards of the 16th and 17th centuries. There were consistent accounts of girls suffering serious injuries, of prolonged and brutal beatings. Many testimonies referred to young women who had entered your service in good health, and then, after a period, had sickened and died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths attributed to these alleged injuries or to sheer debilitating neglect. And perhaps most chillingly, there were numerous accounts of girls who had simply disappeared, their families given vague excuses or no information at all as to their fate. The numbers cited by Thurzo and his investigators were alarmingly high, suggesting a pattern of alleged cruelty that extended over many years and across your various properties. It's a mainstream historical fact that over 300 witness testimonies were allegedly collected during Thurzo's investigation, though the complete, original transcripts of all of these are not universally agreed upon by historians or fully extant today. Much of what we know comes from summaries, letters, and official reports compiled by Thurzo and his officials, which naturally reflect the perspective of the prosecution. Interpreting these testimonies presents enormous challenges for modern historians. The potential for exaggeration due to fear, collective hysteria, or even the suggestive nature of the investigators leading questions in an era that lacked modern legal safeguards for witnesses cannot be discounted. Translation issues, if statements were indeed filtered through interpreters, could have led to subtle shifts in meaning. And understanding the social context is paramount. What truly constituted normal disciplinary practices versus excessive or criminal cruelty in the master-servant relationship of that period. The lines could be quite blurry, and the power of a noble over their household staff was immense. However, the sheer volume of the accusations and the reported consistency of certain themes across many different testimonies, from individuals who may not have known each other, clearly created a powerful and deeply disturbing impression on Palatine Thurzo and his investigators. Historians and legal scholars continue to debate the overall reliability and specific interpretations of the many witness testimonies in the Báthory case. They consider factors such as the common methods of interrogation used in the early 17th century, the potential for coercion or deliberate embellishment by witnesses with their own agendas, and the socio-cultural lens through which accusations of extreme cruelty, or even what might have been perceived by some as witchcraft-like malevolence, were often viewed and prosecuted in that era. In the shadowy sculleries and crowded, cold sleeping quarters of your various castles, you can imagine that the servant girls might have developed their own silent, desperate language of fear, a particular, knowing glance exchanged when a certain bell was rung, indicating your summons, a shared, involuntary shiver when your footsteps were heard approaching, subtle ways of warning newcomers, or expressing a collective dread that dared not speak its name aloud, long before any stern-faced official from the Palatine's court ever arrived to ask them a direct, terrifying question. You can almost picture the official court stenographer, his quill scratching furiously across the parchment, occasionally pausing to re-ink, perhaps muttering under his breath, "And another one? My quill hand is developing a permanent cramp." Are we entirely sure these aren't just very strongly worded complaints about the consistently terrible quality of the castle's daily gruel? Understatement, it seems, was probably not the prevailing mood during those grim interrogations. As these harrowing accounts accumulate, meticulously documented and cross-referenced by Thurzo's diligent notaries, a grim and seemingly undeniable pattern begins to emerge from the chorus of fearful, sorrowful, and angry voices. The sheer weight of such widespread testimony, detailing many years of alleged, almost unimaginable cruelty, and the unexplained loss of so many young lives, becomes far too substantial to be easily ignored or dismissed as mere malicious gossip. It forces Palatine Thurzo, and by extension, the king's court in Vienna, to confront a deeply uncomfortable, politically perilous, and morally urgent question. How does one, in accordance with the laws and customs of the Kingdom of Hungary, bring a noblewoman of Elizabeth Bathory's immense power, vast wealth, and formidable family connections to account for such terrible accusations? As the meticulously documented and deeply disturbing testimonies accumulate in the hands of Palatine Georgi Thurdzo's investigators, a grim and undeniable pattern begins to emerge from the chorus of fearful, grief-stricken, and indignant voices. The sheer weight of such widespread accusation, detailing alleged acts of unspeakable cruelty, and the unexplained loss of so many young lives over a period of many years, becomes far too substantial for even the most skeptical or politically cautious observer to simply ignore or dismiss as baseless slander. The Palatine, and by extension, the King's Court in Vienna under Matthias II, are now confronted with a profoundly uncomfortable, politically perilous, and morally urgent question. How does one, in accordance with the often archaic and class-biased laws and deeply entrenched customs of the Kingdom of Hungary, bring a noblewoman of Elizabeth Bathory's immense power, vast wealth, and formidable family connections to any form of meaningful account for such terrible accusations? Navigating this complex legal and social landscape would have been like trying to chart a course through a treacherous swamp filled with hidden quagmires and dangerous political beasts. First and foremost, you, Elizabeth, were not a common criminal. You were a Bathory, a Noblewoman by marriage, names that resonated with centuries of power, land ownership, and military glory. In 17th century Hungary, as in much of Europe, the nobility enjoyed significant legal privileges and immunities that simply did not apply to the peasantry or even the urban merchant classes. A noble was typically entitled to be judged by their peers, a court composed of other nobles. The prospect of a public trial for a countess of your stature, especially one facing such scandalous charges, would have been almost unthinkable. It would risk not only besmirching the illustrious Bathory name, but also casting a dark shadow over the entire Hungarian aristocracy, potentially weakening their standing both domestically and in the eyes of rival powers like the ever-watchful Ottoman Empire or the sometimes overbearing Habsburg monarchy itself. The king and his Palatine would have been acutely aware of the need to maintain a degree of stability in a kingdom already strained by external threats and internal religious and political divisions. The political considerations for Georgi Thurzo were immense. Your family connections were far-reaching and still potent. While your husband Ferenc Nadasdy, the Black Knight, was deceased, your son Pal was coming of age, and you were related by blood or marriage to many other influential figures, Gabor Bethlen, for instance, who would later rise to become a celebrated Prince of Transylvania, was a kinsman. Alienating the wider Bathory clan, or other powerful families allied with them, could spark dangerous feuds, or even outright rebellion. Furthermore, the vast Nadasdy Bathory estates, comprising numerous castles, thousands of acres of fertile land, and scores of villages, were a glittering prize. It is an undeniable, if often cynically viewed, aspect of such high-profile cases involving wealthy aristocrats that the potential confiscation of their lands and fortunes could be a powerful, if unspoken, motivator for some of those involved in the prosecution. Thurzo himself, or indeed the crown, might have had an interest in seeing these estates redistributed to more loyal or politically compliant parties, or simply absorbed to bolster royal coffers. It's a mainstream historical fact that the legal proceedings against you, Elizabeth Bathory, were highly unusual in that you, as a high noblewoman of undeniable rank, were never formally put on public trial for your alleged crimes, nor were you ever formally sentenced by a convened court in the way a commoner would have been. This deviation from standard procedure eloquently highlights the immense influence of your social standing and the extreme political sensitivities that surrounded your case. The existing legal framework itself may have been ill-equipped to handle such an extraordinary situation. What specific laws applied to a countess accused of committing such atrocities, primarily against her own serfs and servant girls? Individuals who, in the eyes of the law at that time, possessed very few, if any, substantive rights against their feudal overlords. The primary concern of the authorities, it seems, was less about achieving perfect abstract justice for the alleged victims, many of whom were from the lowest rungs of society, and more about neutralizing a perceived threat, protecting the honor and stability of the noble class, and preventing an even wider, more damaging public scandal. Palatine Thurzo, a shrewd political operator, as well as a man of some reputed piety, would have had to devise a strategy that balanced these competing pressures. His approach involved gathering what he clearly considered to be overwhelming and irrefutable evidence through the numerous witness testimonies. He would have undoubtedly consulted extensively, if discreetly, with King Matthias II, and likely with other key members of the Hungarian nobility, and perhaps even with influential members of your own extended family. Your sons-in-law, for instance, György Zrínyi and Miklós Zrínyi, from another very powerful noble family, and your own son Pál Nádasdy, would have had a vested interest in protecting the family name from utter ruin and securing their inheritance. It is plausible that they might have reluctantly cooperated with Thurzo to ensure a more contained, less publicly destructive outcome, rather than risk the catastrophic fallout of a full-blown public trial and potential execution of their matriarch. You can almost imagine a frantic flurry of sealed confidential letters crisscrossing the kingdom, carried by exhausted couriers on lathered, mud-spattered horses, polite but increasingly firm inquiries from the Palatine's office, perhaps indignant or pleading, or even subtly threatening responses from various Báthory kinsmen and allies, all discussing your unfortunate and deeply regrettable situations in the carefully coded euphemistic diplomatic language of the era, which mostly translated to how in the blazes do we make this monumental, potentially kingdom-shattering scandal go away with the least amount of public fuss, and preferably without anyone really important losing their head, or even worse, their extensive and very profitable lands. The concept of punishment for a member of the high nobility, even for the most heinous of alleged crimes, was often vastly different from that meted out to commoners. Public execution, a common spectacle for ordinary murderers or thieves, was almost unthinkable for someone of your lineage. Instead, punishments might involve social disgrace, known as infamia, a severe blow to a noble's honor and standing, the confiscation of property, or in extreme cases, a form of imprisonment, often within the confines of one of their own castles, effectively removing them from society without the public stain of a common execution. The royal legal advisors in Vienna and Buda were probably frantically flipping through ancient dusty law books and feudal charters, muttering to themselves, "All right, so what is the official, legally sanctioned protocol for when a fabulously wealthy countess, who happens to be related by blood or marriage to half the kingdom's most influential families, is credibly accused of, well, that? Is there a specific chapter heading for excessive staff discipline bordering on catastrophic human resources, failure, and possible demonic possessions? Probably not. Legal historians and scholars of early modern European justice systems continue to debate whether the ultimate handling of your case, Elizabeth Báthory, represented a pragmatic, if somewhat irregular, application of existing legal norms and privileges afforded to the high nobility of the time. a politically expedient bending of the rules designed to avert a larger crisis and protect the ruling class, or, given the horrifying nature and sheer scale of the accusations, a fundamental and deeply cynical miscarriage of justice for your many alleged victims. Your personal defense strategy, had you ever been allowed to voice one in a public forum, might have been a haughty, "Look, running these massive, drafty, and perennially understaffed castles isn't exactly a walk in the park, all right. Sometimes a highly stressed noble lady just has a bad century or two. Surely, allowances can be made." It probably wouldn't have swayed many judges, but one can imagine the sentiment. And so, through this complex, often shadowy, and intensely fraught interplay of existing legal considerations, raw political power, deeply entrenched family interests, and the ever-present, overriding need to maintain social order and the prestige of the Hungarian crown, a specific course of action regarding your fate, Elizabeth Báthory, begins to solidify in the closed councils of the Palatine and the King. It will not be a judgment delivered in a noisy public courtroom before the curious and horrified eyes of the world, nor will it be the result of a lengthy, adversarial trial with lawyers and cross-examinations. It will be something far more contained, more discreet, more suited, perhaps, to the delicate, perilous, and almost unprecedented nature of your particular case. And so, through that complex, often shadowy, and intensely fraught interplay of existing legal considerations, raw political power, deeply entrenched family interests, and the ever-present, overriding need to maintain social order and the prestige of the Hungarian crown, a specific course of action regarding your fate, Elizabeth Báthory, begins to solidify. It will not be a judgment delivered in a noisy public courtroom before the curious and horrified eyes of the world, nor will it be the result of a lengthy adversarial trial with eloquent lawyers dramatically presenting evidence and impassioned witnesses taking the stand. It will be something far more contained, more discreet, more suited, perhaps, to the delicate, perilous, and almost unprecedented nature of your particular and increasingly notorious case. After months, or indeed years, of painstaking investigation, of collecting those hundreds of disturbing testimonies, and undoubtedly after much behind-the-scenes deliberation with King Matthias II and other influential members of the Hungarian nobility, Palatine György III finally decides that the time for decisive action has arrived. In the depths of winter, specifically on the 29th of December in the year 1610, he, accompanied by a formidable contingent of his own soldiers, officials, and notaries, makes his way to your primary residence at that time, the imposing and somewhat isolated Countess Castle. Imagine the scene: the arrival of such a high-ranking royal official, the Palatine himself, with an armed retinue, at the gates of your fortress. Even for a countess of your standing, this would have been an event of profound gravity, signaling that the whispers and investigations had now escalated to a critical, unavoidable confrontation. The historical accounts of what precisely transpired upon Thurzó's arrival vary in their details, and some have undoubtedly been colored by later sensationalism. Some of the more dramatic versions claim that Thurzó and his men caught you, Elizabeth, virtually in the act of mistreating a servant girl, or that they discovered horrific evidence immediately upon entering the castle. However, a more sober, and perhaps more historically plausible, interpretation suggests a more formal, if no less tense, confrontation based on the considerable body of witness testimonies already meticulously collected. Whatever the exact sequence of events, the outcome was swift and decisive. You, Elizabeth Báthory, were effectively placed under arrest, detained and confined within the very walls of your own castle. Simultaneously, or very shortly thereafter, several of your principal household servants, those most frequently named in the testimonies as your alleged accomplices in cruelty, were also arrested. These included figures like Dorothea Sentes, known as Dorkau Ilona Jo, also called Ilona Jew, Janos Ujvari, a servant often referred to as Fiko, and a woman named Katalin Benika. What followed starkly highlights the vast difference in how justice, or what passed for it, was applied to the nobility versus commoners in your era. While you, the Countess, faced no public trial, your arrested servants did. In early January of 1611, just days after Thurzo's arrival at Chaktis, these alleged accomplices were subjected to a formal, if exceedingly swift, trial presided over by judges from Thurzo's court. Given the practices of the time for individuals of their low social standing, accused of such serious crimes, it is almost certain that torture was employed to extract their confessions. Unsurprisingly, they were found guilty. Their sentences were brutal and carried out quickly. Again, we shall not dwell on the graphic specifics, but it suffices to say that their fates were grim and typical of the harsh penal codes of the age for those not protected by noble privilege. For you, Elizabeth, there was no such public spectacle. There was no formal reading of charges against you in an open court, no jury of your peers assembled to weigh evidence, no pronouncements of guilt or innocence by robed judges. Instead, your judgment and subsequent sentence appear to have been more of an administrative and political decision, delivered and enforced by Palatine Thurzo, undoubtedly with the prior knowledge and explicit approval of King Matthias II. This decision was based on the accumulated weight of the witness testimonies and driven by the overriding need to neutralize the source of the scandal, protect the honor of the interconnected noble families, and prevent the politically damaging fallout of a public trial of a Báthory. The sentence decreed was as unique as your situation. You were to be subjected to lifelong strict house arrest within the confines of Chaktis Castle. This unusual sentence, effectively condemning you to imprisonment within your own home without the due process of a formal trial, has been a subject of considerable historical debate ever since. Historians continue to analyze the legality and propriety of this action, with some viewing it as a pragmatic, if legally questionable, solution to an extraordinarily difficult and politically explosive situation. From this perspective, it was a way to stop the alleged atrocities, satisfy to some degree the calls for justice from the local populace, and perhaps concerned clergy, and yet simultaneously shield the Hungarian nobility and the Báthory name from the full ignominy of a public execution, or a formal conviction for such monstrous crimes. Others, however, view it as a fundamental denial of due process, regardless of any assumptions about your guilt or innocence regarding the specific charges. Was it justice, political expediency, or a carefully managed cover-up designed to protect powerful interests? The debate lingers. Your son Paul and your influential sons-in-law, the Zerini brothers, likely played a role in these arrangements, perhaps reluctantly agreeing to your perpetual confinement in exchange for retaining control over the vast Noblewoman Báthory estates, and ensuring the family inheritance was not entirely lost or confiscated by the crown. The precise conditions of your confinement have also been subject to some legendary embellishment. Later, more lurid accounts sometimes claim you were walled up in a single room with only a small slit for food and water. While the reality was undoubtedly grim, it is more probable that you were confined to a specific suite of rooms within Chaktis Castle, heavily guarded, completely isolated from the outside world, and with all communications strictly controlled. Your children, those who were still young, were certainly removed from your direct influence, and their futures managed by other family members. Your vast estates were placed under a form of administration, their revenues carefully managed, ostensibly for the benefit of your heirs, but also undoubtedly under the watchful eye of Thurzo and the crown. You can imagine the local villagers of Choctaw and the surrounding areas, once the Palatine's judgment was known, and the castle gates were effectively sealed upon you, immediately beginning to weave new, even more elaborate and fearful tales about the imprisoned countess. Every flickering light seen in a high castle window at night, every strange, mournful noise carried on the wind down from the castle hill, would now be fodder for their already active and terrified imaginations, the very first threads of a dark legend that would only grow wilder and more monstrous with the passage of time. Your opulent chambers, once the seat of your considerable power and authority, now become your prison. The tapestries, depicting heroic scenes or pastoral idyls, now seem to mock your confinement. The heavy oak doors, once opened at your command, are now barred against you. The windows, offering glimpses of the rolling hills and distant forests you once ruled, now serve only to emphasize your isolation. This is your new reality, a stark and unyielding consequence of the whispers that grew into a roar of accusation. This is not a modern corporate takedown where you get a hefty severance package and a quiet retirement. This is the 17th century aristocratic equivalent of being fired, disgraced, and informed that your office is now also your permanent, inescapable, and rather drafty jail cell. The official minutes from the high-level, very private meeting where your sentence was ultimately decided probably read something like Item 1. The matter of Countess Báthory is considerable, deeply troubling evidence of, well, general and prolonged unpleasantness on an unprecedented scale. Item 2. A public trial, politically catastrophic, terrible for noble PR, might give the Ottomans ideas. Item 3. Proposed solution, strict, lifelong house arrest, lots of sturdy bricks and mortar if necessary, problem effectively contained. All in favor? Excellent. Item 4. Refreshments. Bureaucracy, even in its most dramatic forms, has its own particular unchanging cadence. And so the judgment, unceremonious yet absolute, is rendered not in a public court of law, but within the cold, familiar stone of your own ancestral halls. A judgment delivered by the stern decree of the Palatine. The heavy doors of Choctaw Castle are barred from the outside, the windows perhaps offering only tantalizing, unreachable slivers of the vast, sunlit world you once moved through with such freedom and authority. Your fate, Elizabeth Báthory, is sealed. Your world, once sprawling with estates and influence, has now drastically, irrevocably, shrunk to the oppressive confines of a few designated rooms. Now begins a new, stark, and profoundly silent chapter. Your long, lonely years of close confinement within the forbidding, isolated walls of Choctaw Castle. And so, the judgment, unceremonious perhaps, but undeniably absolute, has been rendered not in a public court of law with its clamor and spectacle, but within the cold, familiar stone of your own ancestral halls, a stern decree delivered by the Palatine of Hungary himself. The heavy oak doors of Choctaw Castle, once opened wide at your command to welcome guests or dispatch orders, are now firmly barred against your egress. The windows, those narrow portals to the vast, sunlit world you once moved through with such untrammeled freedom and authority, now perhaps offer only tantalizing, unreachable slivers of the rolling hills and distant forests that were once entirely yours to command. Your fate, Elizabeth Báthory, is sealed. Your world, once sprawling with numerous estates, alive with the bustle of countless servants, and resonating with the echoes of your power, has now drastically, irrevocably, shrunk to the oppressive, suffocating confines of a few designated rooms. Now begins a new stark and profoundly silent chapter in your extraordinary life. Your long, lonely years of close and unyielding confinement within the forbidding, isolated walls of Countess Castle. This imprisonment, which commenced in the very last days of December 1610, or perhaps the first days of January 1611, was not, you understand, a descent into some dark subterranean dungeon filled with rats and dripping water, as later, more lurid imaginations might picture. You were, after all, still a countess, a member of one of the most illustrious families in the kingdom, despite the horrifying nature of the accusations against you. Even in disgrace, your noble status afforded you certain considerations that would never have been extended to a common criminal. So, your prison was a suite of rooms within your own castle, rooms that you perhaps once occupied in happier, more powerful times. But they were a prison nonetheless. Doors that once opened at your whim were now locked and bolted from the outside. Windows might have been barred, or perhaps simply offered views onto an empty inner courtyard, deliberately chosen to prevent any communication with the outside world. You were under constant, vigilant guard, soldiers loyal to Palatine Thurzo, ensuring your complete and utter isolation. Contact with the outside world, as you had known it, ceased almost entirely. Your children, Paul, your son and heir, and your surviving daughters, Anna, Catalin, and Orsolia, were by all accounts removed from your influence, their futures and fortunes now in the hands of their guardians and their powerful spouses. Letters, if any were permitted to reach you, would have been heavily censored, and your own ability to communicate with anyone beyond your immediate jailers would have been severely, if not completely, curtailed. The bustling life of the castle, the comings and goings of stewards, servants, guests, and petitioners, would now be just a faint, distant murmur, sounds from a world to which you no longer belonged, perhaps heard dimly through thick stone walls, a constant, painful reminder of all that you had lost. The passage of time in such profound isolation must have taken on a strange, distorted quality. Days would have bled into one another with a stultifying monotony, each one a near-perfect echo of the last. What could you possibly do to fill those endless, silent hours, those long, dark nights? Perhaps you had access to books, devotional texts mostly, or Stoic philosophy, their pages offering a temporary escape, a silent dialogue with minds long dead. Maybe you were permitted needlework, your fingers still skilled at creating intricate patterns on linen or silk, though now for no audience but yourself. You might have paced the confines of your chamber like a caged animal, your footsteps echoing hollowly on the stone floors, measuring out the slow, agonizing crawl of minutes, hours, days, weeks, months. Or perhaps you simply sat, gazing out at whatever limited view your window afforded, lost in memory, in regret, in bitterness, or perhaps even in a strange, detached kind of peace. This is, of course, largely speculation. Solid, verifiable details of your daily existence during these years of imprisonment are exceptionally scarce. Historians and biographers continue to speculate about Elizabeth Báthory's state of mind and daily routine during her confinement at Countess, with some suggesting she maintained a proud, unrepentant, and defiant demeanor to the very end, while others imagine a gradual descent into deep melancholy, perhaps even a turn towards solitary religious contemplation, or simply a slow, weary resignation to her fate. The sheer weight of your lost power, Your vanished status must have been a crushing burden. You, who once commanded vast estates and hundreds of servants whose word was law within your domains, were now utterly powerless, dependent on your jailers for your most basic needs: a jug of water, a plate of plain food, a fresh candle to ward off the encroaching darkness. The news of the outside world, of the ongoing wars with the Ottomans, of the political intrigues at court, of the fortunes of your own family, and the management of your confiscated or administered estates, would have reached you only in fragmented, unreliable whispers, if at all. You were in essence a forgotten figure, a non-person, erased from the vibrant tapestry of Hungarian noble life. Even while still breathing its air, you might have passed the time by meticulously redecorating your prison rooms in your head, over and over again. You might ponder. That rather grim tapestry depicting Uncle Vlad the Impaler, enjoying a light afternoon snack with his enemies, is getting just a trifle dreary. Perhaps something with more cheerful kittens, or a nice calming geometric pattern. The options for actual redecoration, one imagines, were severely limited. The relentless monotony would have been a formidable enemy in itself. Perhaps your only regular, if entirely unwelcome, human interaction, beyond the silent, perfunctory delivery of your daily meals, was the periodic changing of the guards stationed outside your chamber door. You would see different sets of stern, impassive faces belonging to soldiers who would rarely, if ever, meet your eye or engage in any form of conversation. You might have found yourself wondering, in those long, silent hours, if these rough soldiers believed the wild, terrifying tales that were undoubtedly now being whispered with even greater fervor in the villages nestled below the castle hill, or if they were simply bored men, reluctantly doing a tedious and unenviable job. You might have even tried to glean some faint scrap of news about the happenings in the wider world from their occasionally overheard, muffled coughs, or the distant metallic clatter of their armor as they shifted position. A truly thrilling, if somewhat pathetic, form of high-stakes eavesdropping. The highlight of your week, you might sardonically muse, could have been the discovery of a particularly interesting and architecturally ambitious cobweb forming in a high corner of your room, or perhaps the rare fleeting visit of a mouse brave enough or foolish enough to venture into your solitary domain. You might think, if your once sharp sense of Báthory wit had managed to survive the crushing isolation intact, dinner and a show, the mouse, one suspects, probably had a rather different perspective on that particular encounter. This solitary confinement, this stark existence within familiar yet now alienating walls, continued for just over 3.5 years. It was a period of profound silence, of deep isolation, a slow, inexorable fading from the world of the living. The once powerful Countess Báthory, mistress of vast domains, renowned for her lineage and her wealth, was now little more than a prisoner in her own home, a shadowy figure whose name was already becoming synonymous with dark and terrible legends. And so the seasons turn, viewed, if at all, through the narrow, constrained lens of your castle prison. The fresh green of spring, the heavy heat of summer, the melancholic golds of autumn, the biting cold and deep snows of winter, each arrives and departs with predictable regularity, each cycle marking another year of your silent, isolated, and increasingly forgotten existence. But even the strongest stone walls and the most securely barred doors cannot hold back the relentless, pitiless march of time indefinitely, nor can they forever postpone that final, inevitable, and universal appointment that awaits every mortal soul, whether they be a queen in her palace or a countess in her castle prison. And so the seasons, those indifferent artists of time, continue their relentless cycle, painting the world outside your narrow prison window with their familiar hues, each rotation marking another year of your silent, profoundly isolated existence within the cold stone embrace of Countess Castle. Spring, with its tentative promise of renewal, gives way to the heavy, languid heat of summer. Autumn arrives, its melancholic golds and crimsons, a poignant reminder of the vibrant life you once knew. And then comes the biting cold and deep, muffling snows of winter, locking the landscape, and you even further into a state of suspended animation. The once powerful Countess Báthory, mistress of vast domains, celebrated for your illustrious Báthory lineage and your Báthory wealth, is now little more than a forgotten figure, a closely guarded prisoner in your own ancestral home, your name already beginning to curdle into something dark and infamous in the whispered tales of the common folk. But even the strongest, most formidable stone walls and the most securely barred doors cannot hold back the inexorable, pitiless march of time indefinitely. Nor can they forever postpone that final, universal, and utterly inevitable appointment that awaits every mortal soul, whether they be a king in his opulent palace or a disgraced countess in her lonely castle prison. During those long 3.5 years of strict confinement, from the very end of 1610 or the dawn of 1611, your physical health, one can only surmise, likely began a slow, steady decline. The lack of fresh air and meaningful exercise, the probable plainness and monotony of your daily provisions, a stark contrast to the lavish banquets of your former life. The psychological stress of isolation, disgrace, and the loss of all power and agency. These would inevitably take their toll on even the most resilient constitution. Historical records concerning your specific condition or any particular ailments during these final years are exceptionally scarce, almost non-existent. Unlike the detailed testimonies about your alleged earlier deeds, your period of imprisonment is shrouded in a profound, almost deliberate silence. Then, on a day in late summer, specifically the 21st of August in the year 1614, your earthly existence came to its quiet, unceremonious end. You were around 54 years old. The precise cause of your death is not officially recorded, lost to the mists of time, and perhaps the deliberate reticence of your captors. It was likely attributed to natural causes, the cumulative effect of your harsh confinement and deteriorating health. There are no dramatic accounts of your final moments, no tearful family farewells, no public pronouncements. One imagines your death was discovered simply, perhaps by a guard bringing your meager morning meal, finding you still and silent in your chamber, the once fiery spirit finally extinguished. The official cause of death, noted on your certificate, had such detailed documents been commonplace for imprisoned nobles at the time, might have read something suitably vague, like a lingering malaise or a general wasting of the constitution, or perhaps, with a touch of dry bureaucratic poetry, Tuesday. The news of your demise would have been conveyed to Palatine Thurzo, and through him, to the king. For such a high profile, if disgraced, prisoner, there would have been no grand public mourning, no elaborate funeral rites befitting your noble Báthory and Báthory lineage. Your burial, like much of your final years, is somewhat shrouded in obscurity and conflicting accounts. Some historical sources suggest you were initially interred in the local church at Countess in November of 1614, a few months after your death. However, it's also widely believed that the local villagers, their minds filled with the terrifying stories that already surrounded your name, vehemently protested your presence, even in death, in their consecrated ground. Consequently, it is often stated that your remains were later, perhaps secretly, removed and transported to the Báthory family crypt at Exit, your ancestral home, to be laid to rest amongst your formidable, and often equally controversial, kin. The exact truth of your final resting place remains one of the many lingering uncertainties in your dark and complex story. With your death, the immediate chapter of Elizabeth Báthory, the living woman, concluded, but the consequences of your life and the actions taken against you continued to ripple outwards, particularly concerning your children and the vast estates you once controlled. Your surviving children, your son, Paul Nodesty, now a young man, and your daughters, Anna, Catalin, and Orsolia, who were married into other prominent noble families, inherited the extensive Nodesty properties. These estates had, during your years of imprisonment, been managed by administrators, including Palatine Thurzo himself, and your influential sons-in-law. Now with you gone, the legal complexities of the inheritance had to be fully settled. The shadow of your scandal undoubtedly hung heavy over your children. They would have faced the difficult task of navigating their lives and managing their inheritance whilst bearing a name that was rapidly becoming synonymous with unspeakable cruelty. One imagines they made considerable efforts to rehabilitate the family honor, or at least to live down the profound disgrace your condemnation had brought upon them. The division and long-term management of the Nodesty and Báthory properties were matters of significant political and economic interest. Legal and economic historians continue to examine the precise disposition of your vast estates following your death, debating the extent to which your effective condemnation, even without a formal trial conviction, affected the inheritance rights of your direct children versus the competing political and financial interests of the Crown Palatine Thurzo, who died only 2 years after you, in 1616, and other powerful noble families who might have coveted a piece of such valuable land holdings. While the bulk of the property likely did pass to your heirs, as was customary and politically expedient to avoid further alienating powerful clans, the entire affair undoubtedly left the family's influence somewhat diminished, and their holdings subject to careful scrutiny. One imagines the inventory of your last personal possessions, if such a melancholy list was even formally taken by your jailers upon your death, would have been a rather stark and poignant affair, perhaps a worn devotional book from your youth, a single tarnished silver cup, a few threadbare items of once fine clothing, a heartbreaking contrast to the glittering silks, the chests of precious jewels, and the vast catalogues of land and property that had once defined your worldly existence. It was in essence the ultimate, final audit, conducted by mortality itself. Your rather extensive estate sale, had one been advertised, might have been rather sparsely attended, focusing less on valuable antiques and more on the unique, if somewhat niche, selling point of slightly used, historically significant castle, comes complete with its own rapidly developing dark legend and a persistent, inexplicable draft in the North Tower. A specialist market, to be sure. And so, Elizabeth Báthory, the once feared and powerful Countess Nodesty, passes from the world, not with the elaborate pomp and solemn ceremony that would normally have befitted her noble birth and high station, but in the quiet, isolated ignominy of her castle prison. Her physical life has undeniably ended, the controversial chapter of her earthly deeds now apparently closed. But death, for such a notorious and enigmatic figure, is very rarely the final word. In fact, for Elizabeth Báthory, her demise was merely the fertile, shadowy ground from which a dark, incredibly enduring, and terrifyingly potent legend would now begin to sprout, to twist, and to flourish with almost completely unchecked and increasingly lurid abandon through the centuries to come. And so, Elizabeth Báthory, the once formidable Countess Nádasdy, sovereign mistress of vast Hungarian domains, passes from the world of the living, not with the elaborate pomp and solemn public ceremony that would typically have befitted her noble birth and high station, but in the quiet, almost furtive ignominy of her castle prison at Countess. Her physical life, a tapestry woven with threads of immense privilege, considerable power, and ultimately profound disgrace, has undeniably ended. The controversial chapter of her earthly deeds, at least those she could commit herself, is now apparently closed. But death, for such a notorious and enigmatic figure, a woman whose name was already becoming inextricably linked with whispers of unspeakable horrors, is very rarely the final definitive word. In fact, for you, Elizabeth Báthory, your demise in August of 1614 was merely the fertile, shadowy ground from which a dark, incredibly enduring, and terrifyingly potent legend would now begin to sprout, to twist, and to flourish with almost completely unchecked and increasingly lurid abandon through the ensuing centuries. In the immediate aftermath of your death, there would have been a concerted effort, particularly from the Hungarian authorities, like Palatine Thurzó's office and the king's court, as well as from your own surviving family members, to ensure the scandal surrounding your name died down as quickly and quietly as possible. There had been no public trial, no detailed, officially published record of the charges or the evidence for widespread public consumption. This official silence, this lack of a definitive, publicly accessible narrative, created a kind of vacuum, and into this vacuum, as always happens, rushed the powerful currents of oral tradition, local folklore, and eventually the more considered, if not always entirely accurate, accounts of early chroniclers and historians. In the villages and small towns nestled in the shadow of your former castles, Countess, Sarvar, Deutschkreuz, and others, the stories would have continued, undoubtedly taking on new life, now that you, the feared countess, were no longer a living presence. Passed from parent to child, from one villager to another, around flickering hearth fires on long winter nights, would have been largely based on the collective memory of the official investigation, the substance of those hundreds of witness testimonies, or at least the rumors of what those testimonies contained, and the very real fear and awe your power once inspired. Details would inevitably become blurred, exaggerated, or conflated with pre-existing local horror stories of cruel feudal lords, wicked stepmothers, or other malevolent figures from the rich tapestry of Central European folklore. The imposing, now largely silent, castle of Countess self, the site of your long imprisonment and death, would have become an even more potent focal point for these spooky tales, a brooding stone presence on the landscape, embodying all the dark deeds attributed to its former mistress. For many decades after your death, your story remained primarily a feature of this local oral tradition, a regional cautionary tale. The first significant published accounts that began to codify and more widely disseminate the legend didn't appear until considerably later. While Palatine Thurzó's investigation certainly generated a trove of official documents, letters, and summaries of testimonies, these were largely administrative or legal records, not intended for broad public circulation. One of the key early literary milestones in the formation of your enduring legend is often cited as the work of a Jesuit scholar named Laszlo Töröcsi, who in his 1729 publication, Tragica Historia, presented one of the first detailed, albeit already somewhat embellished, narratives of your alleged crimes. This was over a century after your death, and Tarochi himself was drawing upon earlier, perhaps less formal, notes and oral traditions collected by other scholars or clerics who had an interest in such grim historical matters. It's important to understand that even these early written accounts were not dispassionate, objective historical analyses in the modern sense. They were often written with a clear moralizing or didactic purpose, and they were already beginning to shape the narrative in particular ways, perhaps emphasizing the most shocking aspects to serve as a warning against tyranny or godlessness. The nature of this early legend in the 17th and early 18th centuries, before the later, more famous vampiric embellishments became attached to your name, was primarily focused on themes of extreme cruelty, sadistic torture, and the alleged murder of a very large number of victims, predominantly young servant girls. The stories highlighted the terrifying abuse of aristocratic power, the vulnerability of the peasant class, and the castle itself as a remote, almost inaccessible place of horror where unimaginable deeds could occur beyond the reach of normal justice. At this stage, your legend was still largely a Hungarian, Slovak, and Central European phenomenon, a dark stain on the annals of your own region, rather than the internationally recognized icon of horror you would later become. Several factors contributed to the tenacious growth and enduring power of this burgeoning legend. The sheer, almost unbelievable nature of the alleged crimes, even when stripped of later exaggerations, was inherently shocking and memorable. Your incredibly high social status, a countess from one of the most illustrious families in the land, made the accusations all the more scandalous and fascinating. The very lack of a full public trial, and the somewhat murky, politically expedient circumstances of your condemnation and lifelong imprisonment created an aura of mystery and left many questions tantalizingly unanswered, providing fertile ground for speculation and the weaving of even darker narratives. The simple passage of time also allowed for details to be forgotten, for new elements to be incorporated, and for the story to be molded to fit different cultural anxieties or narrative purposes. And as with many such tales, there was always the potential for the story to be used for political ends, perhaps to further blacken the image of certain noble families, or to serve as a cautionary example in power struggles. Folklorists and social historians continue to analyze these early Báthory narratives with great care, attempting to distinguish potential kernels of genuine historical memory, however distorted from what might be common folkloric motifs of cruel tyrants or wicked nobles that have been found in many cultures throughout history. They debate how much of the developing legend was uniquely specific to your particular case, versus how much might represent an accretion of pre-existing narrative tropes and anxieties that simply found a convenient and suitably high-profile historical figure to attach themselves to. Long after your physical presence had vanished from the world, you can imagine the local peasantry in the villages surrounding Yaktis might have developed their own quiet, almost unconscious rituals. Perhaps a particular wild herb, known for its protective qualities, always hung over the cottage doorway, or a specific, hurried prayer whispered whenever they had to pass too close to the castle ruins on a moonless night. These would be small, superstitious acts, born of a lingering fear, a testament to the chilling power your legend had already begun to instill in the local consciousness. It's like how a particularly notorious historical site today might still attract ghost stories and urban legends. Your castle became one such focal point, its crumbling stones a constant, brooding reminder. The early, slightly overzealous biographers and chroniclers of your tale were probably already thinking, back in the 1700s, this story is undeniably good, quite chilling, in fact, but it needs just a little more oomph. Perhaps a few more dramatically improbable details, and a general pervading air of sea was definitely, quantifiably more evil than your average, run-of-the-mill feudal overlord, who occasionally had a serf flogged, job done, legend enhanced. And so, in the decades, and eventually the first century, following your lonely death in that silent castle chamber, the story of Elizabeth Báthory, the once proud Countess of Exist, began to solidify, to take on a more defined, if ever more terrible, shape. It was passed down in hushed, fearful fireside tales, in local laments and folk songs, and eventually, in the more formal, though not necessarily more accurate, writings of early antiquarians and chroniclers. It was already a grim and profoundly cautionary tale of noble cruelty, of power unchecked, and of innocence lost. But this, remarkably, was only the beginning of your journey into infamy. The legend, already dark and potent, was still evolving, still gathering new layers of shadow and dread, silently preparing for an even more dramatic and famously sanguinary transformation that would eventually elevate you from the status of a mere historically cruel noblewoman to something far more iconic, far more monstrous, and far more terrifying in the eternal, blood-stained annals of dark legend. And so in the decades, and indeed the first full century, following your lonely demise within the stone embrace of Exist Castle in 1614, the story of Elizabeth Báthory, the once powerful Countess Báthory, began its slow, inexorable journey into the annals of dark folklore. It solidified, as we've seen, through hushed fireside tales, through the fearful lamentations of local peasant communities who lived in the shadow of your former domains, and eventually, through the more formal, though not always entirely dispassionate, writings of early antiquarians and chroniclers like Laszlo Tarocci. By the early 18th century, your narrative was already a grim and profoundly cautionary tale, a chilling archetype of noble cruelty, of power unchecked, leading to monstrous abuse, and of innocence tragically lost on an almost unimaginable scale. But this, remarkably, was only the beginning of your journey into ultimate infamy. The legend, already potent and deeply disturbing, was still quietly evolving, still gathering new layers of shadow and unspeakable dread. It was, in essence, silently preparing for an even more dramatic, far more lurid, and famously sanguinary transformation, a metamorphosis that would eventually elevate you from the status of a mere, albeit exceptionally cruel, historical noblewoman to something far more iconic, far more monstrous, and infinitely more terrifying in the eternal, blood-stained chronicles of dark legend, the Vampire Countess. For much of the 18th century, after Tarocci's Tragica Historia of 1729 had given your story a more fixed literary form, the narrative, while horrifying, remained largely focused on the themes of extreme physical cruelty, sadistic torture, and the alleged mass murder of numerous servant girls. The motivations ascribed to you were often depicted as sheer, unadulterated sadism, an almost incomprehensible pleasure derived from inflicting pain, or perhaps a terrifyingly uncontrolled violent temper. The famous, or rather infamous, elements of vampirism, the bathing in virgin blood to retain eternal youth, the drinking of blood, the quasi-supernatural quest for beauty through sanguinary means, these were not yet prominent, or indeed, present at all in most of these earlier accounts. You were a monster, yes, but a human monster, your evils rooted in worldly cruelty, rather than supernatural craving. The truly significant shift, the point at which your legend takes that decisive turn into the realm of the undead and the blood-soaked, appears to have occurred later, towards the very end of the 18th century, and solidifying dramatically throughout the 19th century. It is during this period that the lurid motifs of blood-bathing and vampiric practices begin to attach themselves firmly and seemingly irrevocably to your name. It's a mainstream historical fact that these now famous elements of your legend, specifically the idea that you bathed in the blood of your virgin victims to preserve your own youth and beauty, do not appear in any of the contemporary 17th century witness testimonies taken during Palatine Thurzo's investigation, nor are they mentioned in his official letters or reports. These sensational details are later additions, grafted onto the existing narrative of cruelty, likely gaining traction through a combination of evolving folkloric traditions and the burgeoning Gothic literary movement of the time. The late 18th and early 19th centuries witnessed a widespread European fascination with vampires and other macabre, supernatural themes. Tales from the Balkans, reports of alleged vampire panics, and early works of vampire literature, such as John Polidori's The Vampire, published in 1819, all contributed to a cultural climate ripe for such stories. Your existing legend, already so dark and centered on a powerful, enigmatic noblewoman accused of terrible crimes in a remote, spooky castle, provided an almost irresistible framework onto which these newly fashionable vampiric tropes could be projected. The connection between blood and the sustenance of life, or the preservation of youth, is an ancient archetypal one, found in many cultures. To link your alleged cruelty with a desperate, perverse quest for eternal beauty through the means of blood offered a new, psychologically potent and undeniably sensational motivation for your supposed deeds. Various writers and chroniclers of the 19th century, often working with a blend of historical accounts, local folklore, and a healthy dose of romantic imagination, began to incorporate and popularize these blood-related motifs. They transformed you from a merely tyrannical feudal aristocrat into a far more glamorous and far more diabolical figure, the Blood Countess, the aristocratic vampire avant la lettre. Your story became less about the mundane, if horrific, abuse of feudal power over serfs, and more about aristocratic decadence, perverse vanity, an unnatural clinging to youth, and a chilling descent into a kind of refined, aestheticized evil. The very lack of a public trial, the silence surrounding your exact fate in confinement, and the already existing rumors of extreme cruelty created a perfect narrative void that these later, more fantastical embellishments could readily fill. It's like your original, already grim, life story got a really terrible, completely over-the-top movie adaptation centuries later, full of gratuitous, anachronistic special effects, and a plot that bears only a passing, almost accidental, resemblance to actual historical events. You, the historical Elizabeth Báthory, who probably worried more about managing your estates and the price of pepper, would likely not even recognize yourself in some of these later, more sanguinary accounts. Bathing in what now? You might indignantly exclaim from beyond the grave. For eternal youth? Darling, have you seen the price of, well, of anything useful back in the early 1600s? A sensible diet, a good night's sleep, and perhaps a discreetly applied lid-based facial powder. The height of 17th century cosmetic science would have been far more practical and considerably less messy, one imagines. Even the infamous Iron Maiden torture device, that quintessential symbol of medieval barbarity, often became associated with your legend its spiked embrace, supposedly one of your preferred methods. However, most historians now consider the Iron Maiden to be largely a 19th century fabrication, at best, a misattributed and highly anachronistic device, with little or no credible historical evidence linking it to your case, or indeed to widespread use in the medieval or early modern periods at all. It was simply another lurid detail that attached itself to your ever-darkening story, adding to the frisson of horror. Folklorists and cultural historians continue to meticulously trace the precise, often convoluted, evolution of the Báthory legend. They debate the specific literary works, the particular folkloric influences, and the prevailing cultural anxieties that allowed for, and even encouraged, the fusion of the historical accounts of your documented cruelty with the distinct and largely separate motifs of vampirism and ritualistic bloodletting. They ponder why your figure, above so many other cruel tyrants and notorious historical figures, became such a potent and enduring international symbol for these particular dark fantasies. Perhaps it was your status as a powerful woman, a countess in her own right, which made your alleged transgressions seem even more unnatural or shocking to later, patriarchal sensibilities. Even centuries later, as the Age of Enlightenment gave way to the Romantic era, and then the Industrial Age, the crumbling, windswept ruins of your former castle at Chakti in Slovakia would themselves become a kind of macabre tourist attraction. Visitors, drawn by the increasingly chilling and internationally famous tales, would explore its decaying walls, their imaginations no doubt populating every dark corner with ghostly screams and phantom victims. Each loose stone, each patch of moss, each gust of wind whistling through the empty window sockets would seem to echo with the weight of your terrible legend. The local guides, had they existed in a formal capacity back then, would have had an absolute field day, and this, ladies and gentlemen, they might have intoned with relish, is the very chamber where, well, we're not entirely sure what precisely happened, as the historical records are a tad vague, and the good Palatine Thurzo was rather discreet, but we're absolutely convinced, based on later, much more exciting books, that it was something truly, unspeakably terrible. Please remember, tips are most appreciated, and do buy a commemorative postcard. And so, through the almost alchemical processes of evolving folklore, sensationalist literature, the inherent human fascination with the macabre, and perhaps a dash of deliberate historical myth-making, your image, Elizabeth Báthory, undergoes a truly startling and profound metamorphosis. The cruel, tyrannical feudal countess of the early 17th century accounts, already a figure of considerable dread, is slowly but inexorably transformed into the quintessential blood countess, a vampire-like icon of eternal bloodthirsty and utterly captivating infamy. But now, standing before this towering edifice of legend, this vast, shadowy mountain of accumulated myth, Gothic fantasy, and outright fabrication, the weary historian, and perhaps even you, our sleepy listener, must ask what, if any, of the actual historical woman, the countess who once managed estates, bore children, and navigated the treacherous politics of her time, truly remains visible. How do we even begin to sift the few, hard, often contested grains of verifiable fact from this overwhelming, seductive, and deeply disturbing legend? And so, through those almost alchemical processes of evolving folklore, increasingly sensationalist literature, and that ever-present human fascination with the macabre, your image, Elizabeth Báthory, undergoes a truly startling and profound metamorphosis over the centuries. tyrannical feudal countess of those early 17th century accusations, already a figure of considerable dread and local infamy, is slowly, but quite inexorably, transformed into the quintessential blood countess, a vampire-like icon of eternal bloodthirsty and strangely captivating evil. Standing before this towering, shadowy edifice of accumulated legend, this vast, dark mountain of myth, Gothic fantasy, and outright fabrication, the weary, conscientious historian, and perhaps even you, our sleepy listener, seeking a calm and rational path through this dark wood, must inevitably ask, what, if anything, of the actual historical woman, the Countess Báthory, who once managed vast estates, bore children, and navigated the treacherous, often brutal politics of her time, truly remains visible beneath these heavy blood-encrusted layers? How do we even begin to sift the few, hard, often contested grains of verifiable historical fact from this overwhelming, seductive, and deeply disturbing legend? The first and most honest admission is that uncovering the objective truth about a figure so shrouded in centuries of lurid speculation, and for whom the primary contemporary sources are themselves often biased or incomplete, is an extraordinarily challenging, if not entirely impossible. More than 400 years have passed since your death in that lonely room in Countess Castle. Memories have faded, documents have been lost or deliberately destroyed, and the narrative has been shaped and reshaped by countless storytellers, writers, and filmmakers, each with their own agenda, their own artistic license, or their own desire to shock and entertain. We must return, then, to those primary sources, the documents closest to your own time. But now, we must examine them with an even more critical, questioning eye. There are the official papers from Palatine Georgi Thurzo's investigation, his letters to the king and other officials, the summaries of the witness testimonies, the records of the trial of your alleged accomplices. These documents are invaluable, as they are contemporary and provide the very foundation for the accusations. However, they are not without their significant problems. They were, by their very nature, collected for the purpose of a prosecution, or at least to justify the actions taken against you. The potential for bias, for leading questions being put to witnesses, for the selective recording or emphasis of certain details, is undeniable. Not all the original, verbatim witness testimonies have survived, and those that do are often filtered through the language of the notaries and perhaps even through translators. And as we've touched upon, Thurzo himself may have had complex political or even personal motivations for pursuing your case with such vigor. Crucially, your own voice, Elizabeth, is almost entirely absent from the official record of these proceedings, because you were never subjected to a public trial. There is no transcript of your defense, no formal presentation of your side of the story, no cross-examination of your accusers. We have no record of how you might have refuted the charges, explained your actions, or implicated others, beyond a few surviving personal letters on unrelated matters from earlier in your life, and perhaps some reported statements or defiant utterances made around the time of your arrest, the reliability of which is also debatable. The historical Elizabeth Báthory is largely a silent, enigmatic figure at the heart of a storm of accusation. Furthermore, there is a conspicuous lack of verifiable, contemporary archaeological evidence from your castles that directly supports the more extreme and lurid claims of the later legend. No secret blood-bathing chambers, no incontrovertible proof of the fantastical torture devices so often described in sensationalist accounts. So, what can we say, with a reasonable degree of historical certainty, about the historical Elizabeth Báthory? as opposed to the legendary Blood Countess. Most serious historians, sifting through the available evidence, tend to agree on a few core points. You were, undeniably, a member of one of Hungary's most powerful and influential noble families, possessed of considerable wealth and extensive estates. There were indeed numerous and serious accusations leveled against you, primarily from your own servants and local peasants, alleging extreme cruelty and the severe mistreatment of many young women in your service, resulting in a significant number of deaths over a period of years. A formal investigation was indeed conducted by Palatine Georgi Thurzo, which led to your detention and lifelong imprisonment in Jogtis Castle without a public trial, and several of your household servants, implicated as accomplices, were tried, convicted, likely under torture, and executed. What is almost certainly the product of later legend and embellishment are the more lurid and supernatural details. The often cited, incredibly precise number of over 600 victims, for instance, appears to originate from much later accounts, not from the initial investigation, while still pointing to a horrifyingly large number of deaths, was less numerically specific. The infamous tales of you bathing in the blood of virgins to maintain your youth and beauty, or of engaging in explicitly vampiric practices, are almost universally regarded by credible historians as later additions, with no basis in the contemporary 17th century witness testimonies or official documents. These motifs, as we've discussed, belong more to the realm of 19th century Gothic romanticism and folklore than to the actual historical case. Similarly, the elaborate and fiendishly clever torture devices, such as the Iron Maiden, so often associated with your name, are now largely considered to be anachronistic fabrications or misattributions. Given these complexities, it's not surprising that different historical interpretations and schools of thought have emerged over the centuries. Some historians, giving significant weight to the volume and consistency of the contemporary witness testimonies, conclude that you were indeed guilty as charged of appalling cruelty and multiple murders on a shocking scale, even if the supernatural elements of the legend are discounted. Forming a smaller but persistent school of thought, have proposed various political conspiracy theories, suggesting that you might have been framed or your crimes grossly exaggerated by powerful enemies. Perhaps Palatine Thurzo himself, motivated by a desire to confiscate your vast wealth, or by broader political aims to curb the power of the independent Hungarian nobility, possibly even with encouragement from the Habsburg court. These theories often place great emphasis on the lack of a public trial and the potential unreliability of testimonies obtained under duress or from individuals with grievances. A more common, middle ground view acknowledges the likelihood of significant and reprehensible cruelty and a flagrant abuse of your aristocratic power, fitting a pattern of behavior not entirely unknown among some brutal feudal lords and ladies of that violent era, but questions the more extreme numbers of victims reported in later accounts and emphasizes how the subsequent legend has grotesquely distorted the historical reality. Academic debate surrounding your case, Elizabeth Báthory, often centers on precisely this interpretation of the surviving primary sources. Some scholars continue to emphasize the sheer weight and consistency of the witness testimonies as indicative of almost unparalleled systematic cruelty. Others, however, highlight the complex political context of early 17th century Hungary, the often brutal methods of 17th century justice and evidence gathering, and the undeniable potential for exaggeration and misinterpretation in arguing for a more nuanced, or even a deeply skeptical, reading of the accusations that led to your downfall. The truth, as with so many historical puzzles, is likely buried under many layers, and digging through them is like an archaeological excavation of the human psyche and societal fears. Historians trying to find the real Elizabeth Báthory are in essence sifting through centuries of accumulated myth, legend, deliberate fiction, political propaganda, and the occasional, tantalizing, but often frustratingly ambiguous, actual historical fact. It's a messy, painstaking job, and someone usually ends up covered in metaphorical, and sometimes even quite literal, bad guano from exploring those dusty old archives. Even if we were to accept the core accusations of extreme cruelty, the question of why remains largely unanswerable from a purely historical perspective. Were your actions the product of a deeply disturbed, psychopathic personality? Were they a horrifying manifestation of the absolute, unchecked power wielded by some members of the feudal aristocracy in a brutal age? Or were they, as some have even more controversially suggested, partly influenced by folk magic practices, or a desperate, misguided belief in particular remedies for illness or aging? These are questions that delve into the realm of psychology and deep speculation, far beyond what the surviving historical documents can definitively tell us. What is certain is that your castle, Countess, once a symbol of your family's power and your personal authority, has itself become a central character in your dark legend. In your day, it was simply another fairly standard, if undeniably imposing, and somewhat remote, aristocratic residence. Now, thanks to 400 years of chilling storytelling, every crumbling stone, every dark empty window, is imagined by many to be saturated with unspeakable dread and the tormented echoes of your alleged victims. It's truly amazing what a little bit of exceptionally bad PR, amplified over several centuries, can do for a property's long-term reputation. Its TripAdvisor reviews from local ghosts are probably still terrible. And so the ongoing debate continues. The meticulous sifting of verifiable fact from pervasive fiction, a painstaking, perhaps never-ending, task for historians and researchers. The precise, unvarnished, and universally accepted truth about your life and your alleged deeds, Elizabeth Báthory, may well remain forever, partly obscured by the impenetrable mists of time and the deep, captivating shadows of your own monstrous legend. Regardless of the nuanced scholarly arguments and the careful deconstruction of myth, it is often the sensational, blood-drenched, and highly embroidered myth, rather than the complex, ambiguous, and often frustratingly incomplete historical reality that has truly captured and continues to hold the modern popular imagination, echoing with a chilling resonance through art, literature, and film, in ways that continue to both profoundly horrify and strangely fascinate us all. And so the painstaking, often frustrating, and perhaps ultimately inconclusive debate continues amongst historians as they meticulously sift through the brittle, time-worn parchments and the accumulated layers of 4 centuries of storytelling, attempting to separate the verifiable, if often grim, facts of your life, Elizabeth Báthory, from the vast, shadowy, and undeniably captivating mountain of myth that has grown up around your name. The precise, unvarnished, and universally accepted truth about your deeds, your motivations, and even the exact circumstances of your condemnation may well remain forever, partly obscured by the impenetrable mists of time and the seductive, chilling shadows of your own monstrous legend. Regardless of these nuanced, scholarly arguments and the careful, often thankless, deconstruction of myth, it is undeniably the sensational, blood-drenched, and highly embroidered legend, rather than the complex, ambiguous, and often frustratingly incomplete, historical reality that has truly captured and continues to hold the modern popular imagination, echoing with a chilling resonance through art, literature, film, and music in ways that continue to both profoundly horrify and strangely fascinate us all. This enduring fascination with your story, Elizabeth, particularly with its more lurid and vampiric iterations, is a phenomenon in itself. Why does this tale, above so many other historical accounts of cruelty or tyranny, still possess such a potent grip on our collective psyche? Perhaps it's the unsettling combination of your high aristocratic status and the sheer, almost unimaginable scale of the alleged brutality. Perhaps it's the dark allure of the femme fatale archetype, the powerful woman transgressing all societal norms. Or maybe it's the irresistible Gothic appeal of the remote, crumbling castle, the mysterious noblewoman, and the whispers of unspeakable secrets hidden within its walls. The themes of abuse of power, the quest for eternal youth, the dark allure of forbidden knowledge, and the frisson of the vampire myth all converge in your legendary persona, creating a narrative that is both deeply disturbing and strangely compelling. In literature, your legend truly blossomed from the 19th century onwards, fueled by the Gothic and Romantic movements with their fascination for the grotesque, the supernatural, and the psychologically tormented anti-heroine. Writers across Europe seized upon your story, often embellishing it further, solidifying those motifs of blood-bathing and vampiric tendencies that were largely absent from the original 17th century accounts. Throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, you have continued to be a recurring character in historical fiction, horror novels, and fantasy sagas. Some authors attempt a more nuanced, historically grounded portrayal, exploring the political intrigues or your psychological state. Many others, however, fully embrace the Blood Countess persona, using you as a ready-made icon of aristocratic depravity and supernatural evil. Poems have been penned in your name, plays staged depicting your alleged reign of terror, your story constantly reinterpreted to fit the anxieties and desires of each new generation. Film and television, those powerful, modern myth-making machines, have been particularly enamored with your legend. It is a mainstream historical fact that Elizabeth Báthory has been the subject or inspiration for dozens of films, especially within the horror, fantasy, and exploitation genres. Beginning in earnest from the mid-20th century, these cinematic depictions have overwhelmingly, and perhaps understandably from a commercial perspective, favored the most sensational, visually dramatic, and blood-soaked aspects of your story, often sacrificing historical accuracy for gratuitous thrills. You've been portrayed as a vampire, a sorceress, a sadistic monster. Your dark castle, the setting for all manner of Gothic horrors. Documentaries, too, have attempted to unravel your tale, some striving for a balanced historical perspective, others content to merely reheat the more lurid legends. Your character, or characters clearly inspired by you, have made guest appearances in numerous television series, from vampire chronicles to historical dramas, with a decidedly dark and speculative twist. The visual power of your image, the pale, dark-haired noblewoman, the imposing, isolated castle, the whispers of unimaginable suffering, provides irresistible fodder for the screen. Your IMDb page, if such a thing had existed in a form you could comprehend, is probably far longer and more dramatically varied than the actual verifiable historical record of your relatively circumscribed life as an estate manager and eventually a prisoner. Your dark allure has also permeated the worlds of music and art. Numerous musical compositions, ranging from haunting classical pieces to the thundering, aggressive riffs of heavy metal bands. Indeed, The pioneering Swedish black metal band Bathory famously took its name from you, have drawn inspiration from your legend. Visual artists, too, from 19th century romantic painters to contemporary illustrators and graphic novelists, have depicted you in countless ways, almost always emphasizing the Gothic, the horrific, or the tragically corrupted aspects of your story. You have become a muse, albeit a profoundly dark and unsettling one. Even the dark tourism aspect of your legacy continues. The crumbling, windswept ruins of Chocty's castle in modern-day Slovakia remain a site of pilgrimage for those fascinated by your tale, its stones supposedly imbued with the chilling aura of your alleged deeds. Museums in the region might feature small exhibits touching upon your history, and local folklore continues to keep your memory, or at least the memory of your legend, alive. It's a strange kind of immortality, this fame built on fear and sensationalism. You can probably find Elizabeth Báthory themed, well, almost anything on the internet these days, from ironically named Blood Countess artisanal tea blends, one sincerely hopes not literally, to unsettlingly cute, almost cartoonish plush dolls of a stern-looking noblewoman in historical dress. The journey from a 17th century Hungarian accused mass murderer to a niche internet meme and global pop culture icon of horror is a bizarre and uniquely modern one, but perhaps not entirely unexpected in our current age of endless digital content and the relentless recycling of narratives. This overwhelming prevalence of the legend, however, often comes at the expense of historical understanding. The actual woman, Elizabeth Báthory, with all her likely complexities, her societal constraints, her probable, if historically debated, cruelties, and the specific political and legal context of her case, is frequently obscured, if not entirely obliterated, by the far more lurid and accessible fictional monster. Correcting popular misconceptions, once a legend becomes so deeply entrenched, so widely disseminated through powerful media, is an almost impossible task for historians. Cultural critics and media scholars continue to analyze how historical figures, like yourself, are appropriated, transformed, and often grossly simplified by popular culture. They debate the ethical implications of sensationalizing such traumatic historical events and question the impact such portrayals have on our public understanding of the past, particularly concerning issues of violence, power, and the historical representation of women, who are often either idealized or demonized in popular narratives. If you, Elizabeth, had a modern-day public relations agent, they would undoubtedly have a very, very challenging, if not entirely insurmountable, job. Okay, team, they might say, pacing nervously. So the whole bloodbath thing, we're going to rebrand that as an innovative, if slightly misunderstood, extreme exfoliation technique. And the numerous deceased servant girls, deeply regrettable historical human resources incidents. It's all about the spin. People, the spin. And so, the myriad echoes of Elizabeth Báthory, or more accurately, the potent and persistent echoes of her spectacular, terrifying, and endlessly adaptable legend, reverberate strongly throughout our modern world. It stands as a stark testament to the enduring power of a dark story well told, or perhaps, more accurately, a dark story that has been enthusiastically and repeatedly embellished over centuries. But as these modern interpretations, these cinematic horrors and literary fantasies, flicker and fade from our immediate attention, what are we truly left with when we attempt to genuinely unravel the historical core of your dark legacy? And why, after all this time, does this particular chilling shadow from the distant past continue to hold such a tight, almost unbreakable grip on our collective cultural imagination? And so the myriad, often contradictory, echoes of your life, Elizabeth Báthory, or more accurately, the potent and persistent echoes of your spectacular and terrifying legend, reverberate strongly throughout our modern world. They manifest in chilling films, in darkly romantic novels, in thundering music, and in the shadowy corners of the internet, where tales of horror are endlessly shared and reinterpreted. It stands as a stark testament to the enduring power of a dark story well told, or perhaps, more accurately, a dark story that has been enthusiastically and repeatedly embellished over the course of 4 long centuries. But as these modern interpretations, these cinematic horrors and literary fantasies, flicker and fade from our immediate attention, what are we truly left with when we attempt to genuinely unravel the historical core of your dark and deeply unsettling legacy? And why, after all this time, does this particular chilling shadow from the distant feudal past continue to hold such a tight, almost unbreakable grip on our collective cultural imagination? At the heart of this enduring fascination, it seems, lies a confluence of powerful, almost archetypal themes. The historical figure of Elizabeth Báthory, even when stripped of the later, more lurid embellishments, presents us with a powerful noblewoman from a turbulent era, accused by numerous witnesses of committing acts of extreme cruelty and causing the deaths of many young servant girls in her charge. Her case, with its unusual legal proceedings, the lack of a public trial for her, the swift and brutal execution of her alleged commoner accomplices, and her subsequent lifelong confinement and lonely death in her own castle, already contains the seeds of a compelling, if deeply disturbing, narrative. It speaks to the terrifying abuse of unchecked power, the vulnerability of the powerless in a rigidly hierarchical society, and the stark realities of justice, or the lack thereof, in a bygone age. But it is the legend, the monstrous blood countess persona that evolved over the ensuing centuries, that truly cements your place in the annals of infamy. This legendary figure taps into even deeper, more primal fears and fascinations. The addition of motifs like bathing in the blood of virgins to maintain eternal youth introduces themes of perverse vanity, the desperate fear of aging and mortality, and a chillingly literal interpretation of the ancient connection between blood and life force. The later association with vampirism, though historically anachronistic to your actual lifetime, connects you to another potent and enduring archetype of the aristocratic monster, the undead predator who preys upon the innocent from a dark, decaying castle. You become a quintessential femme fatale, a beautiful but deadly noblewoman whose outward refinement conceals an inner depravity, a figure both alluring and repulsive. The story also endures because it is, frankly, a fantastic tale, in the truest sense of the word. It has mystery, what really happened within those castle walls. It has horror, the alleged scale and nature of the cruelty. It has a fascinating, high-status protagonist, or antagonist, depending on perspective. And it has that tantalizing ambiguity that comes from incomplete historical records and the passage of centuries, allowing each new generation to project its own anxieties and interpretations onto your shadowy figure. The boring historical truth, with its focus on witness testimonies that might have been coerced, on political machinations, on the dry details of feudal law and estate management, simply cannot compete, in the popular imagination, with the visceral thrill of a vampire countess bathing in blood. We as humans are often drawn to clear narratives of good versus absolute evil, and your legend provides that in abundance, transforming a complex and perhaps historically murky case of feudal cruelty into an unambiguous fable of monstrous depravity. Most modern scholarly biographies of you, Elizabeth Báthory, meticulously attempt to separate the verifiable historical evidence from these later legendary accretions. They often conclude that while you were very likely responsible for acts of extreme, systematic cruelty and the deaths of numerous servants, the more lurid and overtly supernatural elements of your story, the bloodbaths, the vampirism, the fantastical torture devices, are indeed unsubstantiated by contemporary 17th century sources and are primarily the product of later folklore, sensationalist literature, and vivid imaginations. Yet, even if we try to peel away the layers of myth, the boring historical core of your story still has much to tell us. It offers a chilling glimpse into the social dynamics of 16th and 17th century Hungary. The immense, almost unchecked power wielded by the high nobility, and the often brutal, precarious lives of the serf and servant classes. It illuminates the nature of justice in that era, its vastly different application based on social rank, and the complex interplay of law, politics, and family influence. And perhaps most enduringly, your story, in both its historical and legendary forms, serves as a powerful case study in how legends themselves are born, how they evolve over time, how they are shaped by cultural anxieties, and how they can sometimes completely overshadow and distort the historical reality they claim to represent. Contemporary scholars and writers who grapple with your dark legacy continue to debate the ethical responsibilities inherent in retelling such a story. How does one acknowledge the probable historical suffering of your many alleged victims, those nameless servant girls, whose voices were so briefly heard in Thurzo's investigation, and then largely silenced by history, without sensationalizing violence or merely perpetuating the more ghoulish aspects of the myth? How can we critically engage with the powerful, often disturbing archetypes you have come to embody, without simply accepting them unquestioned, or conversely, dismissing the very real historical accusations of profound wrongdoing? These are not easy questions, and they speak to our ongoing struggle to understand the darkest aspects of our shared human past. It's a peculiar form of historical immortality you've achieved, isn't it? From a feared and reviled Hungarian noblewoman, confined and disgraced in her remote castle, you've somehow transformed into a global brand name for Gothic horror, complete with your own entirely unofficial, one hopes line of spooky merchandise, and a dedicated, if somewhat morbidly inclined, international fan base. You'd probably be utterly baffled, or perhaps, with a touch of that reputed Báthory hauteur, grimly amused by your strange and enduring 21st century celebrity status. And so, our long, winding exploration of Elizabeth Báthory's dark and complex legacy, a journey through historical records, political machinations, whispered rumors, and spectacular, blood-drenched legends, finally comes to its quiet and contemplative close. The imposing stone walls of Countess Castle, both the real fortress that once stood proudly in the Hungarian highlands and the imaginary shadow-haunted castle of countless Gothic tales, begin now to recede, to soften, to dissolve into the mists of time, into the gentle ether of sleep. The faint, chilling whispers of ancient accusations, the dramatic, often contradictory, pronouncements of early chroniclers, the sensational claims of later storytellers, and the earnest, sometimes heated, debates of diligent historians, all these myriad voices now soften, fade, and gently merge into the deep, enveloping silence of the approaching night. Let the figure of the Blood Countess, whether you perceive her as a misunderstood, historical victim of political intrigue, a brutal feudal tyrant, or a monstrous, supernatural fiend of legend, now gently dissolve from the forefront of your thoughts. Her world, with all its stark, undeniable cruelties, its profound, unanswered mysteries, and its layers upon layers of accumulated myth, is now far, far removed from the tangible peace and reassuring safety of your own present moment. There is no need to carry these dark, unsettling shadows with you into your well-deserved rest. The grim procession of alleged victims, the chilling details of supposed tortures, the cold dread of a castle prison, these belong to a distant, sorrowful past, a story that has been told. Release them now. Instead, allow your mind to settle, to become calm and still, and wonderfully quiet, like a deep, undisturbed forest pool reflecting only the serene light of the stars above. Focus now only on the gentle, easy rhythm of your own breathing, the comforting weight of your blankets, the quiet, familiar security of your own surroundings. The stories of the past, however chilling or fascinating they may be, are but stories now. They have been heard, they have been pondered, and now they can be gently laid aside. May your dreams tonight be untroubled, undisturbed, filled only with images of light and tranquility and profound restorative peace. Sleep now, sleep deeply. Sweet dreams.